sort of main thread for this space. It has the agenda, which highlights our guest today, who are Mike Lee and my co-host Exit, who are going to speak about agriculture in Ukraine and the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And then it also sets out some of the discussion topics that I hope we'll get round to after we speak with our guests. And so today, those topics include whether some of the more unique weapon systems in Ukraine may be dwindling, or we've received evidence that numbers are lower than we may have speculated. I wanted to get a bit of a conversation going about the most recent developments in Russian alliances, and that was inspired by announcements about their potential to transfer uranium to Iran and China under different circumstances. And then I thought maybe we could wrap up with a bit of a sort of a meta level discussion, because there were examples this week that came out about use of OSINT, and I thought it might be worth sort of inspiring people to think about uses. People talk about white hat and black hat hackers, but I don't hear a lot of conversation about white hat and black hat uses of OSINT. And I think there also can be legal implications from that. So I hope we'll take the discussion in that direction. I often like to start these spaces by highlighting some resources that are available to us. I guess the first one I'll shout out is I just spent the last hour chatting, listening in this case, to friends of this space. They run a conversation called Tochny. It is linked in the Nest. Their conversation this week is actually ongoing because time zone changes happened in North America at a different time than they did in Europe. So we're overlapping this week, but that's no problem. Hopefully our friends will come and join us once their conversation's done. If you're here, but you also like listening to them, their conversation will be recorded. And through that link, you should be able to access the space's recording. In addition, we have our calendar, which is ably managed by Jacoby, and I appreciate all the work that she's putting into that. Jacoby, I'm wondering if maybe you could just introduce the idea and let us know if there are any particularly interesting events this week.
Sure. The link is in the post that Michael put up in the Nest. It takes you to the public view of the calendar that shows in green exterior events that take place out in the world outside of Twitter Spaces or Twitter. You can look for events on Tuesday. It's an ongoing class that is put out by Observable HQ, which is on its third class of 5, and you can link right there to it, and you can probably see through that same link recordings of their prior classes, the 3 prior classes that have already taken place. One is taking place actually Tuesday, one was on the 9th, one was on the 7th, and then there'll be another one on the 16th and the 21st. Another event also on Tuesday is Johns Hopkins SACE Foreign Policy Institute has an event at 12:45, the U.S. and Russia discussion on where do we go from here when things aren't going the way we expected. Please do check that out. It's linked there on the calendar as well. On Wednesday, there's the weekly Bellingcat Twitch Live, talking news and open source tools. Definitely check that out. It's a very dynamic event. They often have a GeoGuessr in quiz or engagement with people who are watching. So do take part in that, as well as listening to a lot of their interesting tools and things that they share. So if you have any events that you think should go on our calendar, please let me know. DM me, DM Michael, DM any one of us up here, any of the speakers, and we'll try and accommodate you.
Thanks very much. And just to reiterate Jacoby's last point there, we really are trying to make it a community effort. And so it's not just if it's your event, but if you see something interesting, maybe that you think is worth being on the calendar, check if it's there already. If it's not, please do send it to us, because that gradually takes the workload off of us in terms of scanning things. And I'm sure that with all the smart folks in here, there are some interesting things that we miss. Some additional resources. I'll go to the podcasts, and so these are many of the usual suspects this week. There was a new episode of The Russia Contingency, which is done by Michael Kaufman, one of the foremost experts on the Russian military. That one is for subscribers only. However, Michael Kaufman was then a guest on the Geopolitics Decanted podcast, which has consistently been very good. It's by Dmitry Alpertovich. So check that out if you'd like to hear Kaufman's thoughts. Kaufman, along with several other well-known analysts, Mike Lee, Konrad Muzyka, and a few others, actually were in Ukraine for about a week. And I know specifically from their posts, they were in Bakhmut. And they've just started to, release analysis based on that. So I suspect a lot of Kaufman's observations are included in that podcast. I mentioned our friends at Tochny, who are holding their weekly Sunday talks. They're also beginning an interview series, and their first interview was held this Friday. It was with the journalist Michael Weiss. I listened to it. It was very interesting. I follow Michael's work on its own, and he's been following not just wars, including the Syrian war, but events in Ukraine for quite a while. So he has a deep knowledge. In addition, I'll say he's a friend of the space, Andrew Perpetua, who does great work mapping the conflict, and who about once a week will stream and sort of do a walkthrough of his frontline map on the app Twitch. He is now streaming to YouTube. So there is a link in that podcast tweet as well, in case you want to go over and subscribe to his YouTube account. You might prefer watching it there over Twitch. And then finally, so not exactly a podcast, but I wanted to draw your attention to another good resource. It's I'm sure that many of you have followed the posts put out by War Translated, which is led by Dmitry, but he has a team of at least 5 or 6 that I know of who are working with him regularly translating material. And now that we're a year after the launch of the full-scale invasion, it's a reality that the more you want, the more you invest time into your work, and the more you want to promote your work, even if your labor is essentially free, paying for server space and all the tools you need to spread your work far and wide, the costs start to build up. And so I just wanted to note that War Translated has decided they're going to start a Patreon. And so some of their material may be there. Hopefully we're talking to some folks who are involved in translations in connection with the war here on Twitter, who will come to speak with us in next Sunday's space. So we may get into it in more detail at that time. But I just wanted to highlight that War Translated has undertaken that Patreon project, and some of you may be interested in it. Jacoby, we also briefly talked about, I think Eric Toller from Bellingcat had started a thread on resources. Did you see that one? Did you want to mention it?
I was just trying to pull it up, and my computer froze. So if you just give me a minute and come right back to me, I'll bring it up.
Sure. I'll just point out that I often don't have time to speak to it, but I do like putting in a tweet that has sort of an overview of the situation in Ukraine. So I just look to some of the best mappers, and I'll grab 3, 4, or 5 of them each week and put them up. In that I find it helpful to compare, because sometimes opinions differ. And so this week I have included maps from DEFMON, the Institute for the Study of War, and Ukraine War Mapper. And then, of course, there's Andrew Perpetua's work as well, although when I looked, I don't think he had put one out since last Thursday. So I didn't include it, as it wasn't as fresh as some of those others. I'll also mention that a friend of the space is actually streaming some video, and streaming that video on YouTube. You can hear the audio there. There is, some B-roll to the extent that there are videos in some of our tweets that we put up, or images. They combine it all, the audio and the video together. They've convinced me to put a camera in front of myself. So if you're curious what your host looks like while he's talking to you, you can always go and check it out there. We're not archiving it or promoting it significantly yet. It's sort of a work in progress as we learn how it goes, but please consider checking it out. The link to that is in the nest. Jacoby, have you had an opportunity to reboot there?
Still working on it. Just 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So I'll just quickly mention it. It's actually in the tweet. I skipped over it at the time, but it's in the tweet for the calendar. I'll put it up separately. Just bear with me. So Eric Toller is one of the researchers who works with Bellingcat, and he's begun a new thread. And while I enjoy tracking new tools and resources that are helpful for OSINT, this was a thoughtful project that he's begun, which is it's a thread tracking data sources that have been removed or made unavailable. And when I looked at it yesterday, Eric only had one example. It's a mapping app that has now removed access to data in connection with military bases in Europe, I believe, including those in Russia. I know that several months ago, there was controversy one day when Google Earth started to black out some military sites as well. So this idea of tracking data that has been available and no longer is, to understand whether it's just the project wasn't feasible to continue, or whether they've made a policy choice to not make available militarily sensitive data, I think it's worthwhile. So you might be interested in following Eric's thread, or if you're aware of any tools in the last couple of months that were helpful and are no longer around, consider messaging Eric and he might add it to the thread. Okay, so I often like to give some examples of OSINT from the last few days. Usually I find whatever has come up in between spaces. And so there is a tweet in the nest that sets out, I think, 4 of them from the last week. And I'll just to mention them quickly. Dara did a tweet looking at Russian missile strikes so far in 2013, just to see their number, their reported type, launch location, to see whether, when looked at in aggregate, more specifics about the application of Russian doctrine and strategy can be inferred from it. And she draws interesting conclusions that basically they are trying to adhere to their doctrine. It's just not very effective, and that part of their doctrine is, if they're not having the effect that they want, to adjust, to become more effective, and they're not doing that part of it. So you may be interested in that. There's a thread there. Actually, I'll put this one up front too, by OPSEC, who again is a regular in this space. Just as a small example of, he saw a video of a mortar being launched, and he was able to capture in a freeze frame a projectile from that mortar that had a really odd shape. It didn't look to him like a mortar. And he was thinking maybe it was a new type of munition in use. And so he brought it up in a space this week and asked the community about it, and he tweeted about it. And then somebody listening sent him a picture that explained it, which is that the mortars have a tail section, and they'll put sort of propellant rings on the tail section. And apparently on some models, that tail section, I don't know whether it's intentional on all or whether it was accidental in this case, but they will detach from the main mortar round. And so what was caught in the frame was actually the tail section of the mortar, which is why it didn't look like a mortar shell as you normally think of it. And I just bring that up as an example of the audience in spaces like this having some very specific knowledge, many of whom are former military themselves, being able to answer some questions. There was the development by a few sort of online OSINT guys who actually were reached out to by, I believe it was the Washington Post, to recreate a shooting at a demonstration in Palestine. And it's very detailed. The Washington Post would spare no effort. But they recreated a model of the street and of the specific vehicle in use. And then, they took a bunch of different angles of video and they essentially made a 3D recreation so they could put the camera inside the vehicle and imagine as the vehicle is driving down the street, as the perspective shifts to the corner where the shooting occurred, what view would those inside the vehicle have had? So I thought it was obviously that's an extremely advanced application. But analyzing the video in detail is just sort of the thing that many of us do, and this has just been taken to a higher level. And then there was a thread looking at satellite photography, evaluating photos of Iranian air bases that have been dug into the side of a mountain in order to protect them. And the Iranians claimed that this whole complex had been developed and was now operational, but looking at the satellite photography revealed that in fact only one of the mountainside hangars is connected to a taxiway that connects to a runway. And so while they may have dug several hangars and they have a big runway, it's far from complete. And so I thought that was another interesting revelation this week from OSINT. Also, I thought it might be fun to put up a sort of a personal example. I got to work on this a little bit yesterday, in fact. So the final example, it's up in the nest now. It's the first item on the left. All Source News is an account who tracks the activities of cartels, mainly in Mexico. He was actually our guest on Thursday night explaining his processes. And after, he and I have known each other for a while, but after speaking on Thursday and my explaining to him some of the resources that are available, he reached out and said, hey, could you help me with a geolocation of a video? I have a 15-second video of these trucks driving down a street. I think I know what city it's in. I'd love to know specifically where it is, down to the street name. And I said, well, we'll see what we can do. And I reached out to some people I know, many of whom are actually in the space now. And we looked at it together. And if you click on his thread, you'd actually be able to walk through it. And the first step that we took was watching along the route to see whether there were any unique markings, addresses, street signs, marks for businesses. There weren't. We found 3 different signs, but they were extremely blurry and taken at quite a tight angle. So many of them we couldn't make out. Unfortunately, there were no street signs. There were some uniquely colored buildings, which we thought might be helpful, but in looking that up, that's an approach that many towns in Mexico do for touristy purposes. So unless we got lucky enough to get a picture that showed the houses in the specific colored order and configuration, that wasn't much help to us. But as you scroll down his thread, the way that we broke it open is that in the very first second of the video, there is a sign on a wall. And if you're following along, if you click on that picture, it's presented in a completed way. So he's shown it with, here is the screenshot of the video with the sign in it. And then here's the finished picture of the sign, like the high quality. But if you take the first freeze frame and you zoom in, you'll see that it is, we only caught 1 word per line, and it was very blurry and it was at a distance. Ultimately we broke it open by following the details in this sign. In fact, the town name was in the sign, but that was one of the last words we were able to decipher its meaning because it's not a word, right? It's a proper noun. But once we figured out what it was, we were able to determine, because there were words in there like materna and half of the word maternidad and the word sana, meaning health. And so we were guessing that it was actually a public health announcement about maternal health. But that didn't help us until we were able to determine the town. And he had an idea about what town it was, but we couldn't find, searching for maternal health mural, maternal health sign in the town name he thought it was. We couldn't find anything. When we finally deciphered the town name in the sign, as soon as we punched in maternal health ad in Kosala, we searched it and we found the image almost immediately. And, it was a huge breakthrough, but it took us 2 hours of trying to glean details from this video before we have that breakthrough. But once you get it, then all of a sudden you have your answer. And so we were able to find the high quality picture of this sign. It's on the side of a community hospital. We got the address. We then immediately were able to look at the overhead street view of around that hospital, which seemed to match the path of the cars, and then do some quick searching to try to find, touristy photos of that site that confirmed details of the buildings as they passed. And so that's one little example of how a geolocation happens. In this case, it's not hugely consequential. However, Allsource had believed this cartel group was operating in one town, and it turned out that he was off by 50 miles or something. And they were in quite a different town that is not as tightly under their control and suggests perhaps more potential for clash with other groups, which, is interesting and information on its own. And so, many thanks to the people who may be listening who helped digging through those details. The process can be frustrating. When you have the breakthrough, it's pretty exciting. And ultimately getting that one, it really is a team effort in that Allsource gave us the context in the video. I came to the conclusion it was probably a maternal health ad. Others then identified the town name and did the final lookup for the address. So that's an example of how a team effort works. If those are the sorts of, if you have skills like this, or if this is the sort of thing you're interested in, keep attending these spaces. You might find opportunities, and or reach out and let us know what particular skills you might have, and we'll keep you in mind for future efforts like this. Jacoby, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you a couple questions about that, if you have a second.
Sure.
I'm curious so when you say that you collaborated to geolocate this, how did you come together to do that? Were you chatting with each other and just communicating by text that you were trying to find something, or were you able to verbally or audibly discuss how you were looking at the information, or whether or not you were doing that? What do you find is the best way to communicate with people when you're trying to collaborate and pinpoint something, or does it matter? And what's the most important part of that communication that you're engaging in to sort of zero in on what you're looking at and not duplicate each other's efforts, or maybe you are duplicating each other's efforts? I'm just curious how you come together to do that in a way that's productive, if that makes sense.
So I'll admit that we probably didn't collaborate in the most effective way. Many of us have worked together on little geolocations in the past, which is how I knew who was pretty skilled at it and who to reach out to. In this case, Allsource reached out to me, and he also reached out to another regular in our spaces separately. And then, so we were communicating back and forth. Some of the people I know who are good at geolocating weren't keen to be in the spotlight. And so they were willing to help out, but they didn't want to contribute in sort of a group chat format. And so I was very appreciative of their help, because they're particularly skilled and people were happy to say, okay, if there are more people helping us who aren't literally in the room or in the chat space, that's fine. And so there was a bit of passing information back and forth, which probably slowed things down and made it a little less efficient than it could have been. But then after the fact, we had a talk with some people, and the comfort level was up. And so in future, we may set up a dedicated channel, whether it be text or voice, so that everybody is working together. Part of it is also that because this took a little over 2 hours to do, and it's not the first priority in everybody's life, working by text is fine for most purposes, which doesn't mean you have to in real time be paying full attention to this question, because sometimes you'll have a part of the problem in front of you and it helps to go away and have it in the back of your mind, and then something may occur to you while you're focused on other things. So it's not always a real-time exercise. Go ahead.
What I find so interesting about that, I knew a little bit about it just because I heard you sort of conversing about it, is the engagement of people who may not, in differing degrees of engagement. So it's just encouraging to people out there who might want to take part in something like that. You can be, involved in a community or not in various different ways and still be part of a collaborative effort to figure something out. And that people who might want to be taking part in something like that or learning about how to do that, can be encouraged by that.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it reminded me, so Exit, my co-host, who may speak to this at some point later, for 2 or 3 months would every week, usually, hold a sort of geolocation game space, putting up different forms. So sometimes it was text-based clues, sometimes it was just photo clues, occasionally it would be find the exact spot, sometimes it was just identify the country as quickly as possible. And so that exercise reminded this puzzle reminded me a lot of those sort of practice puzzles. And you, Jacoby, in mentioning the Bellingcat space, referred to their going through rounds of GeoGuessr, and that's only become popular in the last 6 months or so. And it's very similar as well to the puzzles Exit put together. And so if you are listening and interested in this sort of thing, but maybe not ready to try to find problems in the wild, or frankly, finding problems that you can try that are, reasonable and worth your time, can be a challenge. So GeoGuessr, it's an app. You can load it in your browser or download it separately, and work on it by yourself, trying, in the way it works is they drop you somewhere in the world in Street View, Google Street View, and you have a limited amount of time to guess where you are on the map, and the most precise guess gets the most points, and they'll put you in with a pool of people to do it. So you're often competing against people anonymously, but you can also set up a room for your friends, or you can go and listen to something like the Bellingcat stream where they'll set up a private room and you can work on your skills sort of with that crowd together. So whether you do it alone or with a group, certainly if you do it with a group on a stream like Bellingcat, you'll hear their thought processes and learn from them, which can be helpful as well. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, one more just item. I put a link to GeoGuessr's profile down in the replies if anybody is interested in playing around with their tools or trying out some of their games. It's a great way to get practice.
Thanks very much for that. Maybe at some point we can convince others among us to just run some fun GeoGuessr spaces on, maybe one night a week. Just come and hang out, because frankly, setting up planning for these twice a week takes a lot of time, but doing something like GeoGuessr in a private room would be more just a relaxing, build your skills environment. Okay, so that's intro to our resources. I'd like to move on. We have 2 guests today. we'll be speaking about Ukrainian agriculture, which is of course is a critical issue since the financial survival of both Ukrainians and the tax revenue and so on that's so necessary to the Ukrainian state. It relies on their industry continuing, and agriculture is a significant contributor, particularly because it is one of the goods that leads to significant exports at a time when other export markets like steel manufacturing are limited because of Russian threats in the Black Sea. So we'll discuss agriculture first, and how Mike learns about the status of agriculture in Ukraine, and then we'll have Exit sort of go from interviewer to interviewee, and we'll chat about her research into the daily progress of exports under the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So Mike, thank you very much for joining us today. I know that you've had lots of chat with Exit over the last couple of months in connection with the work that she's doing, and we appreciate you joining us. I know that Exit has already been thinking about some great questions to ask you, so I'll hand it over to her to begin the discussion, and then maybe I'll jump in as a couple of things occur to me.
Thank you. So just as an intro to Mike, he has threatened to write a book about the things he's seen on his travels in Ukraine, on his visits to Ukrainian farms. And I'm putting my hand up now as the first person to buy a copy of that book, because I cannot wait to see what happens there.
Yeah, might take some time. There's quite a few stories to collate there. So yeah. And these are stories back in the good old days when all we were concerned about was talking about farming and stuff, and not invasions and war and stuff like that. So I spent quite a long time living and working in Ukraine, running farm businesses, and finding all sorts of stories, and been dining out on them for years ever since.
I'm excited for it. Can you maybe give everybody a quick rundown of how you became a specialist in Black Sea region agriculture? Because we were talking yesterday and I found your path really interesting.
Yeah, I was teaching agriculture at a university, a college in the UK. Was happily teaching agronomy. I'm an agronomist by training. And then when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1998, there was a lot of redevelopment work in the sort of former Soviet satellite countries, and the two things that were focused upon were teaching techniques or teaching development and agriculture. And because we were involved in teaching agriculture, we suddenly found ourselves in a great deal of demand, and it started initially with one of my colleagues asking me if I could said, would you be prepared to go to Belarus for a week to work at university? And I said, yep, sure. Where's Belarus? And then I found myself on a plane a couple of weeks later, landing in Minsk, and it was proper sort of Cold War. Back in the old days, it was all very severe and whatnot. And we had a great time. I spent a week working at a university in a place called Gorky, which is up on the northeast border with Russia. Had a fantastic time and came back a week later and thought, well, that was an experience never to be repeated. And then I found myself a few weeks later traveling to Ukraine to do something similar. And it just snowballed from there, really. I was teaching in the UK and then conducting these consultancy programs, British Council, EU projects, and we got a big EU Tempest academic project in Ukraine. And then we ended up working in Russia, Romania, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, doing farmer or working with universities or doing farmer training, whole mixed bag of bits and pieces. And then in 2007, I think it was, I was offered a position to work on a full-time project in Ukraine, There was a UK research consultancy company that had helped a private investor raise funds for an agri-investment project, and they needed somebody to run the agronomy side of it. So we relocated to Ukraine, Lviv initially, and it was fantastic. And then the company that I was working for decided they wanted to pull out and leave Ukraine, or leave Eastern Europe as part of their sort of strategic expansion policy. And my wife and I decided that we would stay. We'd built up enough of a client base. We thought, well, we can give this a go. So we went freelance and spent the following years working in Ukraine, running a variety of farm investment projects, basically farming, either directly or indirectly, providing advice, setting up farm businesses, and for investors. And then in 2014, the Maidan came along, and essentially all the private investors pulled out of Ukraine, and our work basically dried up almost overnight. And it was a case of, oh, right, okay, what do we do now? So as we'd been working flat out for a good number of years, we decided, and at this point we had young children, so we thought it was about time we probably took a holiday. So we went off to France and Spain, spent a year trying to regroup, rethink about what we were going to do. And we set up the business which we've got today, which is Green Square Agri Consulting. We moved back to the UK, set up a business, or registered the business in the UK, and developed our crop forecasting consultancy business, which brings us up to where we are now.
Thank you for that. You mentioned that you lived in Ukraine before Maidan in 2014, and obviously what I really appreciate about you the most is that you have contact with farmers all over Ukraine, but also the wider Black Sea region. So you get a real impression of not just what's going on in Ukraine, but what's going on kind of in that entire area. What has changed specifically for farmers in how they operate and the challenges they see after Maidan, and then again after the full-scale invasion? If you can give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, we don't just focus on Ukraine, as you rightly say. We do look at Russia. I mean, primarily we're looking at Russia and Ukraine because they are the two big grain-producing countries of that part of the world, but also Kazakhstan. And then we've got the European countries, Romania and Hungary, and so on. And we're also involved in Moldova, which at one point was the 14th biggest exporter of wheat, briefly, a few years ago, which is remarkable for a country that is absolutely tiny. So 2014, I mean, after 2014, I don't think there was that significant. There was nothing significant that sort of affected the farming in mainland Ukraine. Obviously, Crimea was annexed and became. We kind of lost touch with that. Like we lost our contacts. We can't travel there. But in the rest of Ukraine, I think it was sort of farming as normal, really. It was there was no sort of major issues. The farming business in Ukraine has evolved. If you go back to when Ukraine became independent, there was a lot of a lack of finance essentially, and agriculture withdrew from the sort of the farmland and consolidated itself, but has come back since then, through the following years to where it is today. So post 2014, I don't think there was that significant an issue. Probably economically there was a few issues there, but the farming in Ukraine has continued to develop. Quite often people sort of think of it in sort of basic, it's basic farming. It is quite advanced and is moving on and kind of leapfrog some of the problems that we've been through in the West. They've seen what we've done in the West, and we've been able to introduce new techniques and so on that has sort of progressed it further, until we get to this last year, which obviously has been a complete the invasion has had a huge impact on farming in Ukraine. And I think If we look at the sort of, if you think of farming in terms of sort of the practical side of it, initially back in February last year, it was a case of we don't know what's going to happen because we don't know what's happening. But as the situation stabilized or became, it became the new normal, if you like. Farmers were able to sort of continue to do what they do, which is plant crop and look after it and harvest it and so on. So that's what's gone on. But I think the real issue at the moment is a lack of liquidity on farms. It's not the availability of seeds, fertilizers, and chemicals and fuel. It's not the availability of land and labour to plant. Obviously, there has been some impact, but the big issue is liquidity, a lack of finance to be able to pay for these for the inputs and salaries and diesel and so on. So the supply is there, but this year farmers were selling wheat out of Ukraine at very low prices. The world market price was, for example, was reaching $300 a ton. And we know of wheat that was coming out of Ukraine being bought from the ex-works from the farm at $80 a ton, and then being transported out into Europe, and then sold on at sort of $300+ a ton. So while the world was going through a period, or while the global wheat market was going through a period of high prices, that wasn't necessarily what was being translated to, on the ground in Ukraine. So a very different situation in Ukraine.
And so when you've said that you consult with farmers in Ukraine, but I know that you also put out a fair bit of information publicly. And so if you had to break down does your work, what percentage might be advising the farmers in Ukraine versus advising outside investors, looking to buy in Ukraine versus just providing market information to participants who are interested in the aggregate effect on market prices? It sounds like you do all three of those. I'm just wondering how significant each of them are.
Yeah, I've never actually worked out a sort of percentage, but I think half of our sort of business is crop forecasting. So trying to work out what the crop yield will be based on our assessments, and then we sell that information to traders and interested parties around the world. So that's sort of half of what we do, and is part of the business that we've been working on and developing. And prior to when we initially started it, the way that we approached that was to come at it from a farmer's perspective or an agronomist's perspective, where we would spend time in the fields of Russia and Ukraine, and we would make assessments of the crops the same way that we would do on any farm, but we just did it over 3,000 or 4,000, 5,000 kilometers of Ukraine and Russia. So unlike many other analysts who will look at weather records, we would spend time in the field and gauge an opinion based on what we were seeing. We'd look at weather records and NDVI data and things like this, but we'd also get it very back to basics and sort of kick the soil around and look at the crop and say, well, this is what we think it's looking like. And then the pandemic came along, COVID came along, and stopped us being able to travel. And then 2 years after COVID, we thought, okay, we can get back into the field and do this again. And we woke up on the 24th, 25th of February, and the world had changed. So we've had to adapt and develop the business to be able to sort of carry on doing what we do. Not the way that we would prefer to do it, but we're doing it remotely with our contacts. Prior to pandemics and invasions, we would talk to quite a few investors that were interested in going farming in Ukraine and in Russia at the time. So we would look after people, take people to that part of the world and show them what agriculture is actually involved in, or what's involved in agriculture in that part of the world. The farming side of it is fairly it's fundamental. You put seed in the ground, you put fertilizer and chemicals on it, and then you harvest it and you sell it. But there's a lot more nuance to the agronomy and to the practicality of operating in the Black Sea. That was a part of the. And the other thing we were developing as well prior to COVID and then the invasion was agritourism. We had a lot of interested Western farmers who wanted to go and see what was happening in a part of the world that was having a direct impact on their prices. So if Ukrainian wheat is not looking particularly good, or it is looking particularly good, that affects the world market price. And that affects the price around the world and affects the price on farms, right across the world. So what we started to do was to take farmers and agribusiness people into Ukraine and Russia, and sort of show them what the agriculture was actually about. And if you understand your competitors, then perhaps you're sort of in a position to adapt your business strategically thereafter. So that was the other part of the business. And we also do any sort of consultancy business sort of related to the Black Sea. We do a lot of research, and we're doing some marketing stuff at the moment, and we've been involved in audits and stuff. So anything to do with farming in the Black Sea, that's sort of what we're happy to get involved in. But 50% of our business is looking at crop forecasts, and the rest is split between advising farmers and any other consultancy business that we can get.
That agro-tourism angle is one I hadn't considered, so that's interesting. The reason I ask about how much of it is advice to individual farms versus an aggregate crop forecast is that when you talk about losing access to Crimea in 2014, and then the added difficulties that the war creates in gathering information, I'm curious, using Crimea as an example, is it that the information that you needed is just not available at all? Is it that it became maybe possible to get but uneconomic? Since we tend to be talking about how do you collect information, how do you evaluate it, did it become uneconomic for you, or was it just that there was a reliability problem? Maybe if you couldn't verify it firsthand, you weren't willing to use it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that really. I mean, we like to go into the fields. That was our USP. We would go in the field, and every visit that we made, and we do 4 or 5 a year, or through the growing season at specific points through the cycle of the crop. Because as an agronomist, those were the sort of the key points where you'd be making decisions based on your yield forecast. So we were just doing that over a large area. And we'd often find that we could identify problems before the market spotted them, or before they became aware on the market, or we could confirm or deny that there was an issue. We would see a lot of remote data saying there's a dry area in southern Ukraine. It's been very dry and the crop's dead, and then we'd go there and drive through it. And you would, if you look at EU satellite data, the Mars satellite crop monitoring system, they'll produce these maps with these big red blobs saying that, the crop's suffering in this area, and the inference is that it's just about dead. What we would find, we'd drive through these areas and say there's no significant difference to what we're seeing elsewhere. The crop might have been dry earlier in the season, but crops have an ability to bounce back regularly. So it wasn't as big a problem as was being shown. And being able to go there and see the crop, and to spend time looking at it and driving through the area, that really formulates the sort of your picture. So that is not brilliant, but I've spent 20 years looking at wheat and corn and sunflowers, so I can actually draw quite a lot of information from a good photograph. And we have people that we've worked with us, worked for us, and just general contacts that we know across the Black Sea in general, and they'll often furnish us with photographs of crops. And our photographs are quite boring because we don't want a photograph of a scenic view. We literally want a photograph looking straight down at a crop of wheat or other, corn or whatever it is. And then from that information, if you get enough photographs, you can do plant counts, you can look at pest and disease issues, you can look at weed issues, and you can that adds to the sort of the general information that we've got about weather data and what the season's like and how cold the winter's been and how dry the spring has been, and we can start to sort of build up a picture. And then we still have the ability to get ourselves into some of these countries. We haven't been into Ukraine for a while, but we have been to other regions. So it's not ideal, but we kind of get enough information to formulate a forecast. I mean, in simple terms, there's two parts to the forecast. One is the hectares, how many hectares of a crop has been planted, and what is the yield per hectare for that crop. So it's the yield per hectare is the variable that we have control over, as in, is it a 4-ton crop or is it a 4.5-ton crop? The hectares, which is what we're struggling with at the moment, is we have to take that official data. We can't count hectares. There's no way that we can determine how many hectares of wheat have been planted or corn has been planted. So in the past, we would take the ministry information, and they would provide that frequently through the planting season until the planting season is finished, and we would have a number. So it'd be 5 million hectares of a crop, and we'd say it was 4 tons per hectare, and that would give us our yield forecast. But what we're finding now is that we can't get those numbers. The hectares, they're not being provided, and if we specifically look at Ukraine at the moment, the crop, we're about to start planting sunflower and corn is the big one, really. And how many hectares of corn are going to be planted this spring? And the estimates or forecasts or guesses, I suppose, vary by sort of 20%. So it's completely variable until we until harvest is until the planting is finished. And even then, there's a tendency for the figures to be adjusted afterwards. We can make an assessment on whether we think it's a 5-ton crop or a 5.5-ton crop based on the data that we can gather. But that's sort of only half the story.
So I'll just make a note for everybody down in the listeners that there's links for Mike's work up in the Nest, and you can scroll through some of that stuff. He's really been invaluable to me since this started as a source of information, as also a person to correct me when I need it, because I don't always get everything right, like all of us. And I just want to note how much being an agronomist is like a lot of the OSINT things that people in this space, the geolocation that we were doing yesterday. You start with something that people are telling you, or a rumor or a piece of information that doesn't seem quite right. And then you go out to the field and walk through the field and say, okay, is that actually true? What are the moisture levels? Is this grain actually going to sprout? And are we going to get a crop out of it? All of those types of things. What are the fungus pressures and bug pressures that we're dealing with in that crop? It strikes me that your description there, Mike, is so similar to what we do in our little group over here. Jacoby, you had a question?
Yes, I did. Mike, it's really interesting to hear your background and all the work that you do consulting and how you wound up to where you are. And you had talked a little bit earlier about the price of grain worldwide versus the price of grain coming out of Ukraine, and that there was quite a large disparity. I think it was $300 a ton versus $80 a ton that you mentioned. And I'm curious if you could illuminate why that is. I would think that the price might be higher in a conflict zone because there's less grain available. And so I'm just curious how that comes about.
Yeah, no, good point, good question. I mean, it's down to risk premium. There was grain in Ukraine. There was the when Russia invaded in February, there was the old crop still in store before the new harvest came in, starting from July, August onwards. So that crop was in store, and traders were going into. I mean, initially the Black Sea was I can't remember the actual timeline, but it was the Black Sea export route was closed, and the grain initiative was brought in, and so on and so forth. But the quantity of grain coming out of the Black Sea was initially dropped to zero, and then increased back up to 20%, 30% of where it was before. And in the meantime, grain was coming out of Ukraine across the border into Europe, and there was various logistical issues with that. But what that involved was traders from Europe or from within Ukraine having to go into Ukraine to source wheat off farmers, so to buy wheat off a farmer and physically collect it and physically transport it across the border. And they were factoring in the risk premium. So it's very simple to sort of say they were taking advantage of a situation. But if you're asking a driver of a truck to say, I want you to drive from Romania into Western Ukraine to pick up this wheat, you could die. So the guy said, well, I need paying. So the costs have increased, and that seems to be the situation. So and the other issue was that if the grain that is going out of the Black Sea, farmers are selling from Ukraine into the Black Sea through traders. The supply chain is normally, you've got a series of independent traders who will bulk up quantities of grain from farmers around the country and transport it to the Black Sea ports, and then stick it on a ship or sell it on to another trader who has the contract for a large boat that would then fill it. But what we're seeing now is that until that vessel leaves the Black Sea ports, the farmers are not being paid. And I've spoken to some guys and said, that grain has left their farm and it's been 6 weeks before they've been paid. Now, when I was farming in Ukraine, nothing left the farm until the money was in the bank account. You didn't want people taking hundreds of tons of grain off your farm and then disappearing and not paying you for it. So the standard practice was that you would have the lorries loaded up, ready to go on the farm, and you'd be waiting for the money to hit the bank accounts. And once you got confirmation, the lorries would be released. You literally open the gate and let them go. And what we're seeing now is that farms are not being paid until the vessel leaves the Black Sea ports, and that in some occasions has been weeks. And back to the whole liquidity and cash flow issue, which is the big problem. So I think that answered the rest of your question there.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You kind of touched on it there, but maybe you can expand on, obviously, when the full-scale invasion started and Black Sea exports got shut down, there's a transfer of all of that grain going out of the Black Sea, which really, it affects the greater EU, but not in the same way that grain going by rail and sitting in EU countries that surround Ukraine started to affect them. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts on farmers in neighboring countries and how that's affecting them, but also how that's affecting your work and your ability to do things in those countries?
I think what we're talking about is the fact that grain is going out of Ukraine across the western borders, either by truck or in containers. You can put grain into physically put it into shipping containers, and drive it out and either unload it or take it to the ports. or it can go by rail across the borders, but there's problems with the rail gauge sizes. There's a difference between Ukraine and European rail gauge sizes, so it has to be decanted or unloaded, or the wheels have to be changed over, all of which adds time and cost. But in the initial, after the initial invasion, there was a lot of pressure to get grain out of Ukraine. The ports were blocked, and this was the only viable route. And we started to see small amounts of grain coming out across the borders, across the land. And then over time, some of these logistic issues have been not necessarily solved, but streamlined. I know that the agreement between the neighbouring countries in Ukraine, they've streamlined some of the phytosanitary and veterinarian issues so that it speeds up the operation. But all this grain ended up in Europe, in neighbouring countries in Europe, and has had an effect there. That the farmers in Romania have been vocal about it. They've said, we are being priced out the market because this grain is coming out of Ukraine, and it's affecting our market, and it's also affecting our ability to access the ports because this grain is going through the Romanian ports of Constanța. And everybody fully understands and appreciates this is a requirement, but it's the unintended consequences of whenever there's one action, there's always a knock-on effect, and the reality is that farmers in places like Romania, Moldova, Hungary are paying some of the consequences. We've recently tried to do some work with Hungarian farmers, and they literally don't want to talk to us because, to be blunt, they're pissed off about it, and they don't want to talk to anybody about the fact that they can't sell their grain out of because it's being priced out of the market by Ukrainian grain. So yeah, that's and in Moldova, we physically couldn't find a buyer to take our grain out of to buy the grain out of Moldova. And the other issue to consider is that EU grain or EU agriculture has to comply with quite stringent agricultural policy to access their subsidies. So the other point is that Ukraine grain is being grown as an advantage because they don't have to comply with the same level of agricultural policy and legislation. So they have a competitive advantage over the Romanian, Hungarian, and other European grain. I don't think I don't think it's a deliberate issue as such. It's just that, like I say, the unintended consequences of grain coming out of Ukraine through a route that hasn't been established, because the route was always through the Black Sea because that was the cheapest option, and it would once it's on a boat, you can take it anywhere you want in the world, and that worked. And coming across the borders into the EU has affected farmers there. So I don't know what the answer is. Don't know if there is an answer, but grain has to come out of Ukraine. But it's worth noting that it's not without implications and ramifications.
It absolutely is. I'll just note for the listeners that we are going to take a few quick questions for Mike. So if you have some, by all means, formulate those, and you can request to come up and speak. There should be a mic button on the lower left-hand corner of your screen right now. Just to put a little bit more context around Mike's comments there. Food is a national security issue for all of the countries that surround Ukraine, and Ukraine, obviously. But if you have farmers who can't sell their grain because the market is flooded with grain from other countries, Ukraine and wherever else, or they're having to take less money for it, it obviously gives them less income. They have less equity sitting around to be able to do things with. Maybe some of the smaller farms who don't have as much play in their budget, maybe they fail all of a sudden and you have less farmers. And if you're a farmer in that area who's trying to sell their grain but sees all of these other knock-on consequences of what's happening in Ukraine, and you see your government supporting Ukraine, but maybe you don't feel the support as a farmer, that can really lead you to some not really positive comments and feelings about what's happening in your area. And if food is a national security concern for your country specifically, how do you take the select amount of funds that you have every year in a budget and allocate them to secure food and farming in your country, but also try and secure Ukraine in general and support the efforts that are going on there to repel the Russian invasion? And so it's a much bigger conversation than what we typically hear about. I have one last question for you, Mike. You recently did an interview about Russian fertilizer, and I was just wondering if there was any key points that you maybe could share with us from that.
Yeah, I had an interview with Ivan Postovoy, who's an independent fertilizer and agri-trade analyst, and we had a chat about the Russian fertilizer industry and situation, and to try and sort of understand a little bit more what was going on there. And there's a couple of points. One is that Russian fertilizer consumption or use rather is increasing. And the figures that Ivan gave to me was 46 kilograms per hectare in 2019, and it's risen to 60 kilograms in 2022. So there's been an increase in consumption and use of fertilizer by Russian farmers. The Russian government has a target to increase that to 80 kilograms. How they actually arrive at that figure, we don't know, but essentially Russian wheat production or Russian grain production will increase in terms of its the quantity that's being produced at the moment. And I think the other sort of key sort of takeaway from it was that the amount of fertilizer that was exported out of Russia, and Ivan pointed out that getting hold of this information is quite difficult. So it's a lot of it is word of mouth, and yeah. So the indications are that the amount of fertilizer that was exported from Russia last year was possibly back to similar levels before there was sanctions, and possibly even actually reached a record level. So there was a lot of talk from Russia saying that sanctions were affecting their ability to export fertilizer, or hidden sanctions that were linked to banking facilities. And there was a few misunderstandings as to where the sanctions stopped and started. And once that was ironed out, it appears that the fertilizer was exported back to sort of 2023, 2022 levels. So there doesn't seem to be a problem in terms of Russia's ability to export fertilizer.
Thank you for that. That's a really important thing to note when we keep hearing from Russia, specifically within regards to the Black Sea Grain Initiative renewal that's coming up this week. It's been something that they have repeatedly said, hey, we're not getting any help with our fertilizer exports, et cetera, et cetera. It's their marketing shtick, as I like to call it. And I keep banging the drum that that's not actually what's happening, but it's good to know that there's other people out there that are hearing and seeing the same information that I am. Planet, you had a question for Mike?
Yes, I do. Thank you. It's two questions from Poison Ivy 22 on the YouTube stream. And the first question is what is the ratio between corporate farms and family farms in Ukraine? And the second question is climate change affecting the types of crops planted?
Thank you for that. The first question, corporate versus family farm, I haven't got those figures. I used to have them somewhere, and there was quite a shocking, not shocking, quite an interesting number. There's and I can't remember what it is offhand. I'd have to go back and look it up, so don't quote me specifically on the numbers. But there's quite a chunk of Ukrainian farmland is operated by sort of 20 large agribusinesses, and I think it might be as much as half or even more of the agribusiness or the hectares is farmed by 20 something large-scale agribusinesses. So they are significant, but the family farms are also significant. But there's sort of three levels. So you've got the corporate farm business, then you've got the Ukrainian domestic agribusiness, which could be anywhere up to from a few hundred hectares up to several thousand, and they will be private domestic farm businesses. And then you've got what's referred to as the Ukrainian Ministry of Ag referred to as peasant farms. It's not a phrase we like to use, but what you're talking about there is the people who have small plots. I don't know how familiar you are with the post-Soviet breakup of the collective farms, but essentially, when the collective farms were broken up, they were divided and given to the people who worked on the farm at the time. So you ended up with land owners with anything from half of 1 hectare to maybe one or 2 hectares. What's called pies, and the landlords are called pie chicks. So a lot of those small plot owners would rent their land to the big corporate businesses or the local farm businesses, but a significant portion of them will still grow their own crops on those plots of land for their own domestic use or for sale. So, but in terms of the proportions, I would have to look it up. Your other question was about climate change. Absolutely. There's definitely a change. Everybody I talk to across the world in farming, we talk about changing seasonal patterns. And I think one of the big issues for me, I still do a bit of farming in Moldova, and involved in a few businesses in Romania and in Ukraine. So we are looking at it from a farming perspective. And the assumption was, as climate change kicked in, you would see a migration of where the weather would get drier in the south and warmer in the north, and we'd see a migration of crops. But what I think we are actually seeing is
Sorry, that was me muting you, Mike. I apologize. Sometimes when we pull speakers up, the mute button is right next to the microphone, so apologies.
Okay, so where did I get to? So yes, climate change. There's this change to the seasonal pattern of the weather. So we're seeing less snow in the spring, which puts water back into the soil. We're seeing earlier springs, and then we're seeing colder periods late in the spring. So it's confusing. It's definitely having an impact. But there's certainly an impact. We're seeing drier conditions, and it's making farming a bit more trickier.
And how's that impacting the types of crops planted?
It's not really, because the crops grown in Ukraine and the Black Sea in general, they are commodity crops. So it's wheat and corn are the two big ones. And then in Ukraine, there's a lot of sunflower grown, which was processed in country. I think all the sunflower that was grown was converted into oil, and then the oil was sold domestically and exported. And then there was also soya. And when you look at putting a farm rotation together in places like Ukraine, where you're talking about large farm businesses, there's some peas, there's a few what we call minority crops. People are trying different crops: sorghum, vetches, peas, and a few specialist things like that. But there aren't really a range of crops and markets to choose from. So what do you grow? Ukraine is a big wheat and corn producing country. You grow those in rotation with other crops. What other crops would you grow? In an ideal world, we'd be growing a mixed rotation of sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 different crops. But if there isn't the market for it domestically and export routes, then that's not going to happen. So it's very much about wheat, corn, sunflower, soya, as the sort of the big crops.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that incredibly comprehensive answer.
You're welcome.
Riverside, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Mike, I imagine that AI, or I should say artificial intelligence, had an impact on agro assessment. And I'm wondering how much that has impacted your business. Can you be competitive without it? Is the workforce trained? Are people that you need available and that kind of stuff?
When we're talking about agro intelligence, we're talking about artificial intelligence, but technology in general, are we?
Yeah. Yes.
When we actually launched our business in 2014, or we went sort of public with what we were doing, it was the same year that I think the EU launched a satellite that said we can now monitor crops from space and tell you what the yield is going to be. And we thought, oh, great, direct competition. But it doesn't give you the intelligence that you need. I think we've monitored the EU Mars satellite remote forecasts, and they are consistently 20% plus or minus the actual final yield. So the technology is there. It has the ability to forecast crops, but I don't know, with the algorithms or whatever they use, the technology within the software still needs refinement to actually sort of nail it with a bit more surety. And like I said, we think spending boots on the ground is our phrase, because we think that gives you the complete picture. There is so much that you can tell from remote data, but you do kind of need that sort of on the ground perspective. But I mean, technology in agriculture in general has developed and is developing. There's some very interesting developments on the horizon for farming and the way farmers operate. There's a lot of interest in satellite and drone technology that maps the yield or the infrared radiation from crops. They can identify issues. The problem is we don't necessarily have we have the technology, but we don't necessarily have the research to answer the questions that the technology throws up. And to give you a specific example, I mean, I get contacted by a lot of remote sensing companies that are very interested and tell me that we can remotely sense your crops and tell you how to grow them. I said, well, farming in Ukraine on a large scale is logistical, so it's not a case of, oh, we've identified a problem, let's go and do something about it. It doesn't work like that. We operate with equipment that will go around the farm or around the fields and won't come back again until it's done a full cycle. So we don't have that ability to be flexible. And the other one is, you have a yield map and it shows you that this part of the farm doesn't yield particularly well. And the initial response is we put on more fertilizer to make it grow better, unless you're an agronomist and you look at it and say, well, actually, maybe we put less on because maybe that soil or that land is over a gravel bank or something like that, and is very, it will only ever produce a low yield, and therefore we need to put less on. And we can measure everything, but we don't necessarily have the amount of research to back up the decisions as to what decision do you make with that data. So it's the cart is in front of the horse a little bit. But it will, it will catch up eventually. But technology is great. I have a love-hate relationship with it. I like my laptop, but sometimes a pen and paper works just as well.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time. I might ask one final question.
Mr. Bond, your microphone is not happy right now. And now you're gone.
That's okay. Go ahead, exit.
I know you recently did an article, Mike, with, oh, I see Beth, you have your hand up there. Do you want to ask your question real quick and then we'll move on?
I do. Can you hear me? Mic check?
We can.
Great. Mike, thank you so much for sharing everything. I don't know if you covered my question. I joined a little into your sharing, but I grew up on a 3,000 acre bit of land, wheat, cattle. My grandparents on my mother's side actually come from Ukraine, so I'm really familiar with what you're talking about. What about the mines? What about the Russian efforts to mine those wheat fields? Are you aware of the strategies the farmers are going to take and the risk they're going to take to get those, to get the planting done, to everything? It concerns me. What is going on about the mines? Thank you.
Yeah, no, the simple answer is we don't know. We're farmers. We look at crops from that perspective, and we've got no information in terms of what areas have been mined. By definition, I don't think people tell you where they put mines. That's the whole sort of purpose behind them. But our assumption is that obviously there's an impact, but we don't think it's as big as perhaps that some of the journalists are sort of emphasising, because it kind of makes a good narrative, but Ukraine's a big country. The conflict is contained. I mean, it has been moved. The front lines are moving, and there's been movement. But where there is conflict, where there are mines, absolutely catastrophic. And I don't know what the answer is. One of my my son plays rugby. One of the dads here in the UK. It turned out to be a military ordnance guy that clear up UXBs and stuff. And I was asking him about it, and he said, there's a limit to what can actually be done. So the legacy has a huge amount of potential to roll on for years. The damage to the land where the conflict is taking place has destroyed some of the land. It's going to take a long time to bring that land back in. There's pollution, contamination, and so on and so forth. But obviously where the mines are, there's a huge issue there. But there's in terms of the amount of grain that's being produced, I think that is where it's a problem. It's a 100% problem, but the problem is fairly localized at this moment, and that the caveat is that the lines can move and the conflict can develop, and it could get significantly worse.
We'll take one final question from Stepan. Go ahead.
Right, so I've two questions there, kind of quantitative in nature. First one is, what percent of grain is exported by sea out of Ukraine, and what percentage is taken out over land? And how much of a change have you seen since the beginning of the conflict? And the second one would be, how do export figures from 2022 compare to those of 2021? In other words, was the grain deal kind of enough to meet the demand of the third world countries? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. I'll answer the first one first. Sea over land. I mean, it was all going out through the sea. So pretty much 100% was going out through the ports, Odessa, Chernimorsk, Yuzhny, Mykolaiv, and out some of the Azov ports as well. And the reason was because that's cost effective, and it's all about friction. And you put grain into a boat, and there's a low amount of friction, therefore the cost of moving it is low. How much has that shifted since the conflict? Well, I don't follow this that closely, because it's kind of we're up to the farm gate, and then beyond the farm gate is kind of other people's specialism. But as I understand it, Ukraine was exporting somewhere in the region of 5 million tons of grain per month broadly out to the Black Sea ports. That dropped to zero. And then the amount that was going out through the overland routes started to pick up, and I think it's got as high as 2 million tons. So 2 million tons out the overland routes, and possibly up to 3 million tons. But those figures are moving about, and it depends which month you take it from, or which 30-day period do you sort of take that from. So there's it's moving around a little bit. And your other question, I think, was export figures 21 compared to 22. I haven't really sort of followed that closely, and I couldn't put a figure on it, but it's certainly down on the sort of pre-invasion year marketing year compared to the post-invasion marketing year. There's been a drop, and perhaps Exit could put a number on that for me, but there's certainly a drop.
Okay, well, that's actually a great segue because we will be moving to chat with Exit and Smog in just a moment. But I wanted to thank you, Mike. I thought this was a great conversation. I know that there are other questions people had we just won't have time for today. So maybe you might be open to coming back and chatting with us again in a month or two, just to see if anything has developed. We'll be into a new season by that point. And I wanted to once again highlight that there are links to Mike's website and some of his writing in the Nest. We've had some discussions in this space about how all information, starts as human intelligence or sort of raw original intelligence, and it only becomes open source once somebody makes it available publicly, and that there are degrees to that. So of course, Mike offers a service. He does a bit of a public service here on Twitter by informing us all, but he also has much more specific and actionable information. So if you might be in the market to need details like that on crop production in the Black Sea region, check out Mike's products there. So once again, thanks very much, Mike.
You're welcome, and thanks for the sales pitch. It's always appreciated. But if you want me to come back at some point in the future, the spring planting has started, but we're looking at April, May, and then we'll have a better idea in terms of what the production out of Ukraine will be from that point onwards. So, thank you for having me, and good luck.
Perfect. We'll keep you in mind for that time zone or that time frame of April, May. And speaking of time zone, I know it's also late there, so I appreciate you sticking with us to a late hour. And on that front, we'll move to Exit and Smog. And I understand I understand that Smog, of course, is also UK based, so it's quite late for him. So hopefully we'll get him into the conversation pretty quickly before we don't want to lose him to sleep. I guess before we go to that, Jacoby, did you want to go ahead?
Yes, I just wanted to remind people, if you enjoy the conversation and you want others that follow you or follow this sort of information to join the space, please do retweet it. If you have any questions, request the mic and we'll try and get you up. And that was about it for the moment.
Thanks very much. I always forget to do a quick admin update, so I appreciate that. For those who may not be familiar with Exit's work, she of course is a great contributor in our communities with her work individually on Twitter, tracking the exports in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and she's frequently in our community spaces. So I assume most of you are familiar with her work, but we will be putting up one of her reports in the Nest. And I understand that she's now branching out a little bit as well, sort of writing additional detail on a blog of hers. So we'll have that link in the Nest as well. Together, she and Smog have been for, how long has it been now? 200 days, 200 and some days, every day writing a report on exports in the Black Sea Initiative.
233, I think.
Mm-hmm. And have you missed any?
I don't remember when we started. Do you remember when we started, Smog?
I think we may have started on the first day. I think we did. Well, we definitely talking about beforehand, definitely. But I can honestly say I have missed days. I even missed one last week, much to my shame. But I don't think Exit has missed one day in the whole of. We're coming up to the end of the second period of the Black Sea Grain Initiatives. 120 days each time it's renewed so far. It's been 120 days, and I don't think Exit has missed one day, and that includes Christmas Day.
And that level of consistency, of course, is amazing. It's hard to do. I know that I have tried to do even just weekly reports, or we're now doing these spaces twice a week, and sometimes the drumbeat of needing to produce content can start to wear on you. So that consistency is admirable. So maybe just to start at the beginning, this was a great segue to go from Mike's work looking at the agriculture to the specific issue of its export. I think that we touched on a lot of the reasons for the necessity of the Black Sea grain deal, or its significance to Ukraine with Mike. But Exit or Smog, would you guys add anything to sort of set the stage for why it's necessary, or maybe just the basics of what it is?
So the thing I would add that maybe didn't get touched on earlier is that the grain that leaves Ukraine is then going to different countries. A lot of them fall into lower income countries, which means that they almost universally have a food security issue. And obviously, food security is directly related to the price of food. So if you have a huge exporter of grain not being able to export, that means that prices go up and food security, there's it's proportionally affected there. And so literally grain from Ukraine being exported efficiently, preferably through the Black Sea, will save lives in some of those countries where it ends up.
Yeah,
That
sorry, I just add on to the back of that. One of the key features, which is often misunderstood with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which I actually heard that come up in one of the questions, is all of the grain from the Black Sea Grain Initiative is not designed, was not stipulated in the initiative in the signed documents by Russia and Turkey and Ukraine and Turkey. There was two separate documents. Sorry, but the actual detail is, it is there. It was initiated to get the grain out of Ukraine at a reasonable price, which brings the price on the open market down. Otherwise, we see something similar to the energy issue where the richer countries buy everything up, and then the poorer countries are priced out the market, which actually happened at the beginning when the ports, the Odessa region ports, were blocked. So the initiative is there to open up the export of grain, and the World Food Programme are the people who actually buy the grain using funding from countries such as America and actually Ukraine to distribute the grain where and when it's needed. So it doesn't all go to lower income countries, but that's often a misconception. But a good proportion of it does.
Well, thanks for those details. So going back maybe to the beginning to talk about your work and your process, Smog referred to the fact that you had been talking about the grain deal even before it began, and that I think he may be correct that you put out your first report just about on the first day after the deal was signed. What inspired you to want to track it sort of at this level of detail?
I think food security is probably the number one reason that it was top of mind for me at the time. I have traveled to Africa. I've keep a close eye on some of the geopolitical things that happen there. We were seeing a real significant food security issue in Somalia specifically. I actually went back a couple times this week and looked at some of my first threads, and one of the first things that I commented on was a story had come out of Somalia earlier that week about a family that had to bury their daughter because she had died of malnutrition. And that sucks, and it shouldn't happen. And part of the reason was just that world food programs that traditionally would have purchased grain, wheat from Ukraine and other places, they are fundamentally underfunded to begin with. And then on top of that, when you raise prices so that what they're getting for the amount of money that they can spend is much lower, you just have a problem dealing with that in general. And then simultaneously, I work on a farm. I deal with grain prices and grain futures every day. It's a grain farm that I work on. I know how integral farmers are to feeding the world. And there's one of the bees in my bonnet is the fact that most people don't pay attention to where their food comes from, who grows it, how they grow it, whether or not it's grown with the new wave of agronomy, or whether it's grown by agronomists who are like Mike and maybe ask a few extra questions and think about whether or not you really do need more fertilizer or less fertilizer, those sorts of things. So I would say both of those really influenced me to pay closer attention to that than other people did. And then also, I like to save things that aren't being saved. So I collect one-eyed horses, and I also like to pay attention to things that other people should be paying attention to, but just aren't. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative is definitely high on that list.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me was slightly different angle is being ex-Royal Navy was I know a little bit about the sea and how ships travel and some of the resources we could use to track them. And I think you maybe even asked me to help, and I think that's probably where I came into it. But one of the key things for me was this was clearly going to be an opportunity for Russian misinformation. They were, we'd read the terms of the agreements that had been signed, and we knew that the Russians would pump out misinformation, especially because they're highly influential in the African region. So I took it as an opportunity to collect the data from the start. And I think we spoke about that as it was a good starting point, obviously, at the start, and we could have the information available if anybody needed to counter any sort of Russian propaganda, really.
So for those who haven't seen your report yet, I've actually put it in the nest now. It should be the first item on the left. And it is detail packed. And having followed it essentially the whole time, I know that it didn't start out that way. I'm wondering, to the extent that it had detail, but obviously there hadn't been as many ships, there hadn't been as many products sent out, as as many countries involved. So I'm wondering, where do you guys get your data? And maybe you could walk me through the process of how it's become more detailed as you've continued.
So I'll give you where we started, and then Smog can tell you about the upgrades. We started, so you can go to, and literally anybody in here can do this, can go to marinetraffic.com, and you can look at the ships that are in Ukrainian ports that have their AIS, so their tracker, turned on, and it'll give you information about what that ship is. You can see historical information about the ship. You can look at the size of it. There's green ships and red ships are generally what you're going to see. Most of the green ships carry cargo, and most of the red ships are tankers, which in this case carry food oils of some sort or another. And so when the grain deal was being discussed, and as it was kind of coming into fruition, the first place we started was just making a list of all the ships that had their AIS turned on and that we could actually see, and they had been stuck there since the beginning of the war, so since February 24th. And most of those ships also had crews still on them. There's still a number of ships that still have crews on them. And so there was a human aspect to that as well. And then as the deal was signed and insurance came into place, and they said that the JCC would be the Joint Coordination Center, the UN Joint Coordination Center, sorry. They said they would be tracking it, but the JCC didn't really come out with a lot of really detailed information at the beginning. And so we were kind of watching marine traffic and seeing, okay, well, there's ships moving back and forth, but there's not a lot of detailed information about that. And so we kind of started tracking that and just keeping an eye on it, keeping an eye on whether any of those ships who had been stuck there since the beginning were moving out and how they would have been loaded with grains, foodstuffs in order to be moved out. And when you track things, the easiest way to track them is to put them in pretty little charts and documents and spreadsheets. And so we started with spreadsheets, and you will find out that Smog and I are complete nerds, and we absolutely love spreadsheets. We geek out over them a lot. And so that's where we started. And as we went through kind of the first half of the grain deal, we kind of evolved what we were doing, but we were mostly only tracking outbound ships. We weren't really tracking any of the inbound ships. It was a lot harder to do that because the JCC wasn't really releasing a whole bunch of information about them. But as we got closer to the renewal, and as Russia pulled out of the deal for a time in November, there became a need to track ships that were going into port as well. And it turns out that that really tells a lot more of the story, because each ship that goes into port has to be inspected by teams of inspectors from the JCC. So that includes members. Each team has a member from the UN, from Turkey, from Russia, and from Ukraine. And so we've heard all of these stories from Ukrainian government officials and others, even the UN has stated this, that often Russia will slow down inspections in order to kind of gain even more control about how many of those ships are transiting in and out of Odessa for export. And so tracking that kind of information really became important to be able to demonstrate to people, to say, hey, this really is happening. Like, what you're hearing isn't propaganda. This is factual information. And then Smog, I'll let you talk about what we changed going forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically, Exit is the guru of all things agricultural, and helps with lots of things and puts out the content. And I'm pretty much in the background doing the spreadsheet stuff. So, Mr. Bond, if I'm going on too long about spreadsheets, please interrupt me. But yeah, we started off initially. The JCC was set up, but there wasn't any information forthcoming from them. So from day one, we knew we had to get the information from somewhere. So it was a proper OSINT situation. So we were scrobbling around trying to get information sources. I think there was a Sky reporter, there was a Turkish MOD, there was a couple of very, very small Twitter accounts actually, who were actually putting the information out. They were getting them from places such as Reuters, from their wire service, and I think the Associated Press as well. So getting hold of the data was our initial problem. So we managed to find a few sources, and because in the first week or two, maybe the first month, this information was readily available and in free flow. So we were using these to populate a hastily constructed Google Sheets spreadsheet. So Exit forced me to Google Sheets. I've worked exclusively in Excel previously, so it's a whole different ball game, although everything is very similar. So we created, a table, and then from there we tried to put the information in a presentable format, good visualizations, data visualizations. Everybody likes a good chart, table, gets that information across a lot easier. So we did that, but because of the speed in which it needed to be done, it was very manual, as in each cell would have a formula, and so on and so forth. So if there was a new country added, I'd have to, I'm just looking at it, I looked at the old, we're on version 2 of the Google Sheets now, and I looked at the old one earlier, and there's maybe, I don't know, 20 columns, or no, 10 columns, 15 columns of commodities, and then countries wise there is in the region of 46 different countries. So every time a new country was added, it would take me about an hour to update the tables and so on. So this was obviously not sustainable. But yeah, so a month in, we were suddenly devoid of data. The the Turkish MOD obviously had lost interest in this. The Sky reporter who we initially found as well, she'd sort of lost interest in this and gone on to other things. And we noticed that the other couple of accounts we were following, they were struggling to find the data as well. So at that point, we managed to get hold of the UN. So we got hold of the UN, and they were very kindly started putting out a daily email. So one of the things that's very notable about this is the JCC have sort of evolved along the same time as us as well. So they started out putting daily updates, and then they released their data. So we now have access, or anybody can get access. It's an open source of information for the Google spreadsheet they use. So they've got a Google sheet with literally a table of everything that goes out. However, it's not always right. So one of the key points of the data that we use is that we have to verify it. You know, dates of sailings are wrong. They've put out often updates to the cargo, the weight, and so on. And often don't.
So I'm sorry, are you saying that the United Nations data itself is sometimes wrong?
Yes. I mean, and that goes from things such as just so each ship has got you can have two ships of the same name, but each ship has got its own IMO number. That's the International Maritime Organization. It's got its own unique number. So they get them wrong. They get the dates of sailing. There's one particular ship, which I think Exit has highlighted to the UN, and that they're ignoring her because I think it's just in their interest just to let it go, which sailed at a different date by maybe 2 weeks. So, I mean, it's just little things, but, the key thing about the data that we're pushing out there is we are verifying everything the UN pushes out. We are utilising the resources available to us to track it. Now, the UN only look at where they declare they're going. We will track it to the port it's going to, and using AIS. When we track it to the port it's going to, we've learned quite a lot about this. In certain ports, such as Turkey, a lot of wheat will get milled in Turkey and then exported to its final destination. So we do lose track of it there, but we do try and verify that as much as possible that it is still going to the country is declared to go into. Via other routes. So we are actually verifying that, and quite often ships will float around for a while. We're not under command, so that means they are literally waiting for a new port to go to, and they will go somewhere else. And that happens fairly often. So we do have those figures. So when we say when a ship is declared as delivered on our data, that is delivered to the country that we have tracked it to. So every day, every ship at sea, we look at, see where it is, see where it's been, see where it's going to. And with this comes to where do we get this information? So we get the initial information now from the JCC. So the UN gives us the initial information of what's sailing, when, and what's on board. And then from there we use AIS. So this is the automated information system. So this is ships over a certain size have to utilize this. When we say it's automated to a certain extent. Ships can turn it off under certain circumstances. The automation is that it transmits automatically and receives. There's no sort of intervention by a human there needed. So it will transmit that data, and it transmits things such as position, its course, its speed, where it's come from, where it's going to. Its draft, which is another thing that we look at. The method of transmission is by VHF and satellite. So this is one of the problems we have. So VHF is limited in range, and when you go into places like China, we'll lose sight of them for a certain amount of time. We do get used to how long they're off our system for, but we can also go onto marine traffic and purchase data. So we will do this if it looks as though it's been offline for longer than we'd expect, or if it was maybe heading in a different direction than we were probably looking at and it's dropped off AIS. So we do that often. There is different websites. So there's Marine Traffic is one of the main ones. We also use Vessel Finder. And there is a third one, which we use less so because it tends to be behind the other two. It's called myshiptracking.com. This one seems to have a lot more information on the port data. So as well as the ships having data on them on AIS and on these websites, the ports do as well, and the vessel traffic services. So if we look at the port, I can then see, okay, so I can't see that ship, but if I go to that port and look at their expected arrivals, I can see that it's still declared as an arrival. So that will give me warm fuzzy feeling that the ship is still on its way there. Often we have seen ships at sea, but in one of the AIS websites, it will show us being in a port. So if you then go and buy that data, it will show us as being in that port. So we get that satellite data, and it is more up to date. It costs about £1, but that gets you access to one ship for 24 hours for £1, or you can pay, I think it's in the region of £370 a month for full access, and that I'm afraid that isn't going to happen. I'll sort of round up a little bit now. Version 1 to version 2 of the spreadsheets and the charts. So we created the charts to look nice and pretty, and it gets the information across very well in that visual format. What was a very manual process in the first spreadsheet. So towards the end of the first grain deal, we realised this couldn't go on. It was taking 2 to 3 hours a night to update. And then if anything additional came in on top of that, it was extra countries and extra commodities, and that was obviously an extra hour or so on top. So we spent about overall probably about 3 weeks to create a new one, but using Google. So any gurus down there in spreadsheets use Google Sheets queries now, which is a hell of a lot easier. And it's pretty much automatic. And couple them with Google Sheets, you can also use query with pivot tables as well. So it's like a spreadsheet nirvana. So everything is a lot easier now. There's still niggles with it, but overall the data is probably 99.5% accurate. We have little niggles such as if a ship has got 2 cargoes on and 2 countries it's going to, we can only record 1 country delivery. So if all you spotters out there who've looked at exits posts and you've seen that the UAE has got 11,900 tons of something on board, something delivered, sunflower oil, but there's been 0 ships delivered. So that's because it went to, I think, Saudi Arabia first, and it's gone to the UAE as a declared destination. So there's little niggles like that which are hard to work through, but we're working on that. That whole data transfer was tricky because we were actually updating both spreadsheets for about a week, which was very resource intensive, as you can imagine. I think I've covered everything there. I don't know if there's anything on the back of that exit you think I missed.
I think that was a great description. It's impressive that you guys are actually correcting the United Nations itself sometimes. There are interesting points there about tracking it to its actual destination as opposed to its declared destination. You gave us a breakdown of marine traffic and some of the other websites that you guys use. I'm wondering, if you encounter mysteries, because you've talked about if they have their AIS turned off for a long time or they're not moving, you may check into them. Have you ever used other resources? Do you ever use satellite photography or human intelligence to solve any mysteries?
So I will say that, especially in the Black Sea, when ships are under the care of the UN, they have to, because of the grain deal, they have to keep their AIS on. So that part is really helpful to us there. I'll let Smog talk about what happens on the delivery part a little bit more, but we definitely have used human intel. There's ship spotters that we have worked with in the past to track specific ships that look like they're delivered, but they haven't really updated their AIS yet, and they haven't updated their draft yet, and they're headed back towards now a Russian port. So they're questionable. Maybe whatever they're carrying is still on board, and we're interested in whether it's now being delivered to Russia. So we've worked specifically with people to kind of look at those ships on the way by, get an actual eyeball on them, and say, okay, yeah, that ship really was delivered. It really did have a change in its draught, and we know exactly where that information went. Smog, do you want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, I think that is actually a specific example that we looked at, which was very, very interesting. And I think maybe Exit reached out to some other people as well. So we tracked that ship out and then back again and all the way through, and we were trying to get eyeballs on it to see what the actual draft is. So one of the things with AIS, there are particular things that you do manually enter, such as draft, which is frustrating. So yeah, we look at everything. So there's various things, such as in Bangladesh, for example. A lot of the ships don't actually go alongside in Bangladesh to unload, so we didn't know that until we saw ships there, and they sat at anchor for ages, and it was a little bit. It was there too long. You know, you end up learning to get a feel for these things. It was there too long. So a bit of searching, watching videos, finding out how the Bangladesh ports operate, and yes, they do have barges alongside, and they come and they offload at anchor. So that's not necessarily human, but that's just using resources external, and Google is your friend. There was something else I was going to mention there. Yeah, there's been various things where we've had to go and look for or the ship's name. So you know, we can go online, go on Twitter, and find out what's happening. If it's a World Food Programme ship, they're quite often good at updating, so we can get some good videos as well of things such as them coming in. We've actually reached out to vessel owners, and they're not very forthcoming now with any information when we've had issues with ships. But yeah, we use anything we can get our hands on. You know, reaching out to ports, vessel owners, like I said, anybody who can help us. And like I said, in the Black Sea region, there's some good spotters. What we really need to do is probably get a network of good webcams up. But yeah, you use everything that's available to us. Satellite imagery I haven't used as such yet, because we've maybe I don't know, Exit might correct me on that, but I've not used any. The problem with that is you need to have a good reference material, so you need to know what the ship looks like before you start trying to spot it again. So you need that good reference, because even the best satellite imagery, it's very hard to distinguish different ships.
So my last question before going to Hans, maybe you touched on it a little bit there, but if you had to upgrade your available information, what would you go for? Would it be, you know, you had talked about the subscription to something like Marine Tracker or Marine Traffic. You had talked about, you know, getting webcams set up. You know, which of those might be worth pursuing, do you think?
So a subscription to Marine Traffic, if anybody knows anybody there, by all means, pass them our way. We would love to do that, because you can, when you have one of their corporate subscriptions, for instance, you can add all of these ships to a fleet of ships that you have, and it'll automatically update you every day on where each of those ships are. And just from the perspective of decreasing the workload and allowing more time for the analysis part of it, that would be super helpful. There's been times where I think some of the satellite imagery would possibly be helpful to us, and definitely when looking at specific ports and how they operate, I think that there's some places where we could use that that would be helpful. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. Smog, did you have anything?
No, I think the big one would be Marine Traffic. The data is useful. I was quite lucky. I had about £100 worth of credit with Google for some reason, so it's been spent on satellite. When I say satellite with Marine Traffic, that's not satellite imagery. That is satellite data, so the AIS can update by satellite as well. So if it's too far away from the coast or in the less developed regions where there's less receiving stations, you know, we can get the data on where it is, a past track. Because that's one of the things we look at, as well as past tracks, and make sure it hasn't deviated somewhere else. So I think those are the big things. There's one website I missed, which is there's a Bosphorus Strait website, and it details the ships that have gone through it. So that's quite handy. For example, there was a ship early on which didn't appear to have ever transited the Bosphorus Strait, but it had. So you know, it sounds silly, but the data as you know, me and Exit were quite nerdy, and we quite like our data to be correct. So one of the columns we do have is, when did the ship transit the Bosphorus. So we've got all this sort of data. We've got a lot of data there. We can pull out averages for all sorts of things. We can interrogate it for lots of different sort of parameters. So things like that we can look at. So yeah, I think definitely the marine traffic, it would be the golden egg, I think.
Well, you never know. Maybe somebody listening can connect you, or maybe you can get yourself sponsored. That would be great. Balanced, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much. Exit Smug and Mike, all really interesting information. I'm curious to know, I have more like 3 micro questions than one specific question. So feel free to make the answers as short or limited as you desire based on your, the breadth of the information that you have on this. I'm curious to know, open democracy um, has in the past reported that companies like ADM, Cargill, Louise Dreyfus, and Chinese-owned company Kafka are active players in the creation of a lot of the grains that are farmed in Ukraine. So I'm curious to know, what benefit does Russia actually get from partaking in the Black Sea Grain Initiative? Like, what do they actually get from doing so? That's my first short question.
Okay. So I have a blog I'm writing on this. It's not done. It needs some changes. But arguably, the number one thing that they get, and the number one reason that I think Putin has continued to agree to this, is that they get control over the Ukrainian economy without the use of force. So we've essentially given them, they stopped traffic in and out of Ukrainian ports. International community has kind of said, okay, well, what we need out of those ports is really important. So we're willing to play the game and let you maintain some control over that, but still allow us to get that grain out of the port. And the instrument for doing that is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That essentially means that Russia has control over how much wheat or grain of any type leaves Ukraine through the Black Sea, which is the most economical way for that product to be transported. We've given them all that control, and we haven't really made them pay for it in any way, shape, or form. And so arguably, they get control over the Ukrainian economy because this is it's the only thing they can export economically right now. And they can speed it up or slow it down based on the rate of their inspections every day. They just have like a huge amount of control based on the fact that we've given them. The alternate option to that is to say, no, you can't control what comes and goes from Ukrainian ports, and here's how we're going to guarantee that. It's just that you have to have some people willing to step up and say that they will guarantee that.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Smog.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, Smog, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to quickly say, I'll sort of work backwards a little bit. So at the moment, there's quite a few calls out for people sort of with a bit more clout saying, why should we let Russia have any influence on this, which is probably correct, but unfortunately it was politically expedient to engage them. And at the time, if you remember back, this was just after that Snake Island was lost to Russia, from Russia to Ukraine. So Ukraine regained Snake Island. And that also, in my mind, had a bearing on this. They were less in control of that region. Moscow had been lost, so they were a bit wary of having their ships and submarines too close to the coast, although they can still deploy calibers from them out in the Black Sea. So they had less control, and as we all know, Russia wants to be a bully and wants to maintain control. So, my theory is they were exercising some modicum of control there, or trying to appear to be in control. And with a renewal of the grain deal, which I'm sure we'll come to shortly, I believe that Russia will want it to happen, because if they don't, what will probably happen is similar to the end of November when the grain deal was up last time. The inspections rocketed to I think 40 odd a day on one day when the Russians weren't involved, and everybody will see that the Russians are blocking things, and they've got no influence there. So in my mind, I think the Russians will want it to continue, just to show that they have influence, even if they haven't.
Thanks. The reason I mentioned the global industrial scale agricultural companies that are involved in the production of these crops in Ukraine is I'm wondering, and not looked into this at all, as to whether or not these massive organizations have an influence with the Russian government to instigate them to, or to encourage them to participate in this, because it has a direct impact on these massive multinational industrial scale agricultural companies. Any insight on that, or is that just that's too far away from the actual transport of it?
Mike, if you're still here and want to comment on this, if you know anything, I don't have really specific insight, but go ahead, Mike.
No, I don't have any specific insights either, really. But I would be surprised if they do have significant influence, and I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've looked at the structure of Ukrainian agribusinesses for a while, but I'm not sure how much of the Archers and Bungie and Kofco and stuff are actually operating farm businesses in Ukraine. They are obviously buyers of Ukraine, and will have an influence and an involvement in the farming businesses in Ukraine. But no, I'm not sure that they are heavily involved in have much influence in. I think Russia's doing what Russia will want to do, and the analogy that I've used in the past, which was to use a football analogy, that one of the reasons that Russia is partakes in the grain deal is it's a bit like, if you've got the football and you threaten to take it away, that has a bigger threat. But if you actually physically take it away, then nobody cares what your opinion is after that point. It's so being involved in the grain initiative and then influencing it and affecting it is a position to be in, rather than saying we're not going to be involved in it, and then everybody just turns away and looks in another direction. Possibly, I don't know.
Yeah, the reason I ask about that is because, more recently, again, coming from Open Democracy, stating that Cargill and Bungie have invested nearly $1 billion in increasing production capacity for Ukraine. And so I was curious, considering they have a substantial breadth of work that they do within Russia. I was just curious to see if there was some sort of linkage relating to why Russia would be pressed or influenced to participate in the Black Sea grain deal that maybe people aren't focused upon. It's been stated most recently by Reuters that 75% of the grains that are through the industrial farming mechanisms is 75% of it is through those mechanisms, and nearly 25% of it comes from what they define as peasant farmers or private farmers that are far smaller than these industrial scale farmers. But I'll direct my questions back to the transportation. So thank you for letting me stray in that direction for just a moment. Sorry about that. My last question is with respect to the upcoming potential, likely, and hopeful renewal of the grain initiative. Russia has signaled that they're clearly unhappy with some aspect of the grain initiative, but they haven't specifically noted what exactly they are unhappy about. So are there any indications now as to what specifically they may be asking for? And could it potentially have something to do with the availability of natural gas, manufactured nitrogens, or fertilizer that will be needed for the upcoming seasons? And thanks so much for taking my questions.
So they have been pretty clear that their issue is that so at the time that they signed the Black Sea Grain Initiative, they also signed a secondary document with the UN that is supposed to, if you read it, what it really says is the UN will work hard to try and help Russia export its fertilizers. It really doesn't say anything more than that, other than that they will try to help. And to my knowledge, the UN has worked really hard to work with Russia to export fertilizers that have been held and sanctioned in EU countries, asking Russia to essentially donate the fertilizer because you can't have it back anyways, it's sanctioned. We will use World Food Program ships to take that fertilizer down to Africa mostly, where we will give it to the people that you say you want to help the most. And Russia has said that they are unable to do that for some other sanction reasons that we don't really need to all get into. And then fundamentally, Mike said earlier that he's spoken to a number of people that deal with Russian fertilizers. And by all accounts, Russian fertilizer has had a great export year. They haven't had an issue exporting Russian fertilizer. So what they're saying and what's actually happening are two fundamentally different things. There is a pipeline that used to be used for ammonia exports that comes out of the Yuzhny port, which is one of the 3 ports that's included in the deal. Before the last renewal, Russia had said, okay, well, we want to be able to open up that pipeline and export that ammonia product out of the Yuzhny port. And the US had worked with them to find a US company that would essentially purchase the ammonia at the Russia-Ukraine border. They would take that ammonia to essentially transport it on the pipeline to the Yuzhny port and then ensure that it was loaded and exported from that port. And simultaneously, Ukraine was also saying, okay, well, in order to do this, that's fine, but we need to get something out of the deal as well. We want to include the Mykolaiv port in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which would include basically opening that up. There's a couple of reasons that didn't happen. So number one, if you look at just battlefield actualities, there's too much fighting happening around Mykolaiv right now. It's not actually secure. Those ships would have to pass something called the Kinburn Spit, and that is currently Russian controlled, and any of those cargo ships could be taken out by passing through that area, essentially. Number two, there's a lot of mine activity still over there. That water has not been cleared of munitions, and it would cause a significant hazard to any ship traveling through there. And sorry, there was one other one that I've forgotten now. Essentially, they've said that really isn't something that's going to happen. And so Russia essentially said, okay, well, if you're not going to include the ammonia exports from Yuzhny, we're not going to include Mykolaiv. And that's why we only had a straight across renewal on the last renewal, instead of adding all of these extra ports and prolonging it for a year term. Essentially, there was no change to what was happening. It sounds like they have been discussing doing this again and including those things again, but Russia continues to say that they are having problems with their fertilizer, and there hasn't been any change to the Kinburn spit, and there hasn't been any demining efforts to all of that water. So including Mykolaiv isn't really an option yet either. It's unlikely that any of that will change in the next 7 days. I would be shocked beyond belief if any of that changed. So I don't see any change happening in what is going on here, and whether or not the approval, like the renewal, goes through, I think will fundamentally just be based on what we see currently, and if they prolong that. I don't think we're going to see anything else get included.
Smog, did you want to contribute to that as well?
Yeah. Mine was just a quick one, just to say that the deal will actually roll on if nobody objects to it. So essentially, Russia can bang the drum all they want, but unless nobody actually officially says we declare this no longer valid, the deal is actually designed to roll on for another 120 days. But yeah, the main thing there was exactly what Exit hit on. Was their main complaint is about the ammonia exports, even though they are taxing. I think the export taxes on the ammonia was actually increased because Russia were trying to keep more in the country. And Mike did a good section on that earlier as well. But yeah, and that pipeline. So yeah, just bear in mind that the deal actually also rolls over if nobody declares it void.
I'll just add one quick thing. The daily emails that we used to get from the UN that we no longer get daily, the last month, they have included the note in the emails that no fertilizer has currently been exported from any of these ports. Quit laughing, Smog. We have learned that small, tiny little changes like that in information from the UN is something that you should pay attention to. It often will give you an understanding of the things you should watch coming forward, because sometimes they lead to really important changes, and the UN is kind of setting you up to pay attention to those. So that's the only thing that even remotely makes me question whether or not Yuzhny could come into play.
I love these deep dives. I appreciate all the detail that we're getting into. Russian Bridges, would you like to go ahead with a question?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit on the pipeline from Toladi to Odessa, or I think Exit said Yuzhny. I'm not good with names, but with that pipeline, I think it's 1,500 kilometers long from up on the Volga to Yuzhny, and it crosses through Ukraine, and it actually crosses just where it's going through Ukraine. There's compressor stations along the pipeline that move the ammonia along, and unlike similar to an oil pipeline, but unlike a natural gas pipeline, I don't believe ammonia, like oil, can self-feed its powering. It needs these compressor stations, and it needs some sort of energy source to propel it along. Natural gas, they can use the gas in the line to generate power, to send it along with different types of pumps. But with ammonia, I don't believe that's possible. So that raises the question of whether Ukraine would have the energy with Russia hitting the grid and different aspects of it, because this is like tens of megawatts per pumping station every 100 kilometers or so along that line. And as I mentioned, it crosses, and there's a compressor station just to the north of Kupiansk, which most of us are familiar with. Then it kind of goes down and it crosses the Dnipro between the cities of Dnipro and Zaporizhia, and then continues along there. So there's that question of if Yuzhny, the port of Yuzhny, the export terminal, were to be opened, if Ukraine would have the energy needed to to move the ammonia through this pipeline, because it does require energy, and Ukraine is definitely in a shortage of energy right now. So, and I don't know, I remember seeing Mike Lee's name from last year when I was doing some more efforts along this. But Mike, do you know at all with regards to the Port of Taman and the ammonia exporting facilities there? I know it's only railhead accessible right now, but do you know anything about that? If Russia is able to move ammonia by rail car to that facility, and whether it's able to be exported that way?
No, not my area of expertise. Unfortunately, I've got nothing I can add to that. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Thanks. And that's all I got. But I just wanted to add that there, that we got to, if the Russians, or if we do want to move the ammonia through the pipeline, how it's going to be energized is definitely an issue of concern too.
Yeah, again, I know that you track the detail of these matters, infrastructure and so on, really closely. So I appreciate that. And if anybody who happens to be listening has any insight into that, you can reach out to Russian Bridges and maybe start up a conversation. And if you make any discoveries, please come back and let the space know. So I will, maybe I'll just pose one last combined question to our featured guests at the moment of Exit and Smog, and if Mike may wish to weigh in as well. Question number one, just on a yes or no basis, are you expecting the grain initiative to be renewed? And so maybe we'll just do that round, and then I'll ask my last question. So what do you think, Exit?
I have no idea. I really don't.
Okay, so that's one refusal. Smog, do you want to say a yes or no?
I will put my neck on a line and say yes, because Russia have too much face to lose.
I will say yes, but not after it's gone to the 11th or even the 12th hour and has been stretched to breaking point, and there'll be some repercussions afterwards. But yes, I think the movements of grain is just too big an issue not for it not to happen.
So thanks to all those who answered. And so that leads nicely into my final question, which is, in the event that it's, as you can tell from the daily report, there are 7 days left. So we may come down to the last few hours when we hold our space next week. So maybe, keep an eye on this space. We may have updates then. In the event that it is not renewed prior to the expiry of the 7 days, Smog referred to the fact that it may roll over, but if there's any debate about it, or Russia says we're temporarily withdrawing, or we're not officially rolling it over, does that mean that you guys are done for a while, or does that actually mean a flurry of activity? How do you think it will happen if we don't have an answer come 1 week from now?
So first of all, there would probably be ships stuck in port, and that would mean a lot of tracking, and much more often than we do right now, and probably a lot of reaching out to sources and a flurry of activity at the moment. So that would be very, very busy for a time. What happens after that is a real bone of contention that I don't think any of us have figured out. There is still work to be done to sort out where that grain would go next, how it would get there, what the possibilities are for opening up ports without cooperation from Russia, all of those things. Can you find answers to any of that right away? Who knows? But I imagine that's something that we would concentrate on. And just a really quick note before we go to Smog. If there is a renewal, we always get inspired by that, and then we put in a little bit more time and effort. And if there's things that people see that they're like, man, I really wish that we could get this piece of information out of that data, let us know. Send us a DM. We are happy to answer questions, and we are happy to make new pretty pictures. We like pretty pictures. So if charts and data are your thing, get in contact with us.
Small, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd think that. Well, one of the things. So if we get to next week and it hasn't been renewed, so the ships that are in port will have had then notice that their insurance will run out in 7 days. So the main insurers have said there's a 7-day notice period. So they will then have 7 days to get out and be insured to get out. Sorry, I've got a. Yeah, so I've got some notes written down. Yeah, so what would probably happen is we will do what we did at last renewal and when the grain deal was initially started off. We will end up spending a lot more time looking more detailed at the ships in the Black Sea ports, seeing what they're doing, seeing where they're going, making sure that they're not detouring for mines and things like that, or any sort of indications of anything nefarious going on in that humanitarian corridor. There is actually waypoints set. There's lat and longs for that corridor. They've got to stay in there. They've got to have the AIS on, like Exit said. So we'll be monitoring all that as we did in the early days. What we would possibly see if Russia pull out was also a huge increase in the amount of inspections carried out, which will clear the North Bosphorus anchorages, which are rather full with ships, and the South Bosphorus anchorages at the moment. So that's the sort of things we'll see. For us, are we redundant? Are we going to put our feet up and relax? It depends. If we still get data from the JCC, if they still populate that data as if the grain deal was still in effect, which is what I'd imagine to be happening. I imagine that my thought process is they will continue this as long as the ships can be insured. And that's a leading question, by the way, Exit. But yeah, what I would also say, I have one tab on our spreadsheet, which I'm very proud of, which I know Exit uses to pull out data, but I don't think we produce any charts of it, which is overview 1. So we can pull out lots of different data on what country things have gone to between a date range. I mean, we're talking months, not individual days, what cargo it is, what status, what continent, what income group. So yeah, as Exit said, if you've got any ideas for any data you'd like to see and the deal is renewed, we do tend to have a lot more impetus then to change things, because we know we've got at least another 120 days to go. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up that line of questioning. So thank you very much to both Exit and Smog. You know, as I said at the beginning, your dedication to consistency is impressive. And along with that consistency has come the opportunity to really expand the quality of the product by, getting into more detail, and by making, by showing proof that you're doing good work. I think that, from following your story, that has allowed people to say, wow, they're reliable and it's high quality. And then these human intelligence sources, suddenly become available to you, or you can start emailing with the United Nations where they might not have responded to you, but because you have this resume or body of work, that doors do open. And I think in some ways that mirrors what we've been hearing from other guests, All Source on Thursday in regard to cartel activity, or Andrew Perpetua, who was talking about how when his initial heavily OSINT sourced maps became pretty popular, people on the ground just started reaching out to him and sending him tips. And so that gradual process from doing good open source work kind of opens doors to information streams that aren't as open source, and then you become that bridge that puts it out into the public, which I think adds a ton of value. Okay, so just sort of an administrative note for the space. I like to run these conversations for about 3 hours, meaning I'll probably keep the conversation going for about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes if we have good audience participation. And I'm going to shuffle topics to the extent that I'm not sure we have enough time to run through all of the discussion topics I outlined in the agenda. So the point on alliance development between Russia and Iran and Russia and China, as that's an ongoing story and not so immediate, I'll move that to the end of the conversation if we get to it today. But do have a look in the main tweet that has the agenda. If you're interested in those subjects, you can always read the articles on your own, and we'll likely shift that to a coming space. I will note, thanks to Riverside Kitty, if you look in the nest, the first item on the left is a poll that she's put together to help us out on how do you interact with this space. And so each week before our conversations, I put together that agenda with all of the links. So I'm scanning the news for the 3 or 4 days between spaces. I'm finding all the things that I think are interesting. Then I try to group them together into questions or topics so that we have a theme as we run through the conversation. And I grab all these links and I put them into the thread. And, you know, I'm constantly, as we're having our conversations, referring to it's the item in the nest. And I'm just checking to see, do you guys find value in that many other spaces, some of which have great conversation, don't rely on the links or the resources as heavily as we do, and it takes a fair bit of time. And it's still my preferred style, but I'd like to understand, do you like interacting with items that are in the nest? Do you go further than that and ultimately look at the thread itself? Do you ever contribute to the thread? So maybe you could just take a moment to give a response to that poll, and that'll help guide us in how we're going to do this going forward. So just before moving into the first discussion topic, which is about the dwindling nature of some of the unique weapon systems, I wanted to give updates on things that we've discussed in this space in past episodes or instances, to keep the stories alive. So if you follow along in the nest, the second item at the moment is a tweet by H.I. Sutton. And I think he's quote tweeting. It may be a tweet that's in German, so you'll have to click through to it and click the translate button. But it encapsulates what he's hearing. And of course, H.I. Sutton of Covert Shores is a naval expert, both on Twitter and in his own consulting business. And he's saying that these criticisms of the latest story on the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, these criticisms seem like they have the ring of truth, or he's hearing other naval people saying, boy, I'm not sure how this would work in terms of the ability to sneak a large quantity of explosives onto a ship that they wouldn't have had, cranes or heavy, equipment to move heavy loads. Just that it's not completely adding up the way it's currently being described. And we've previously followed the investigations of Oliver Alexander, who is doing great work, and he continues to. And in some of his latest work on Nord Stream, he is looking at a construction ship that was drifting or causing an unusual track sort of over the points near the explosions of the pipelines for several days in advance. And that's his current area of interest. So go and check out Oliver's profile if you'd like to see sort of the latest hypothesis that he's investigating. But it still remains very much an open investigation with several lines. The next item to follow up on, it's the tweet in the nest by Noel. I've referred to a mystery in terms of arms supply. In that about a week ago now, maybe a little over a week, it was reported that Serbia had supplied munitions for Grad rocket launchers, the big truck-mounted rocket launchers. But then there was a back and a forth in that some documents that came out suggested perhaps they were purchased from a Serbian company by a Canadian company and then forwarded to Ukraine. The Russians were upset, and I believe they called the Serbian ambassador in. And then Russian sources, their mill bloggers, Rybar, came out and said he believed that the documents evidencing the sale of the rockets were in fact fake. And when I presented it to this space about a week ago, I had said, it remains an open mystery. I haven't had the time to dig into it to solve it. This is not a complete answer, but 2 days ago, the president of Serbia, Vucic, came out and he said, well, we don't have complete control over what our private companies do in terms of munitions, and it's a business and we have to make money too, which to my eye is, it's close to an admission or a statement that even if it is true, don't blame the Serbian government. From the Russian perspective, don't blame the Serbian government. And so by way of update, that makes me more confident that a transfer actually did happen. It wasn't just faked, as Rybar claimed. But it's not 100% solved. So, watch this space. If I see anything more, I'll update you. And then last update on past topics, I think a week and a half ago, we talked about bans that were being put in place by various governments on TikTok, including the Canadian government, staffers of the European Union, members of the U.S. Defense Department, and a proposed broader ban in the United States. And then, interestingly, the UK, for government purposes, has now also banned TikTok. So this is an issue that is getting more and more attention, and I suspect there will be more developments on this front as well. So moving into the conversation topics, and if anything that I bring up piques something in that's an interest of yours, or you have a question, please do request the mic. It's the button in the bottom left corner of your screen, and we'll bring you up. And if you're enjoying the conversation for the last sort of half an hour here, please do retweet the space. We'd love to have as many people involved as we can. So the theme for this idea I wanted to bring out is the dwindling nature of some of the unique weapon systems. And there were two tweets that I found interesting in the last few days. The first is a thread that's been put together by John Ridge, and I'm actually going to move this up to the front of the nest so it's easier for you to find. It should be there in just a moment. And what John did was he found an interview with Taras Schmut, I believe is his name, who heads a charity or an organization that privately raises funds to get equipment for Ukrainian soldiers, and has been doing so since at least 2014. And John arranged to have this interview translated, and then he's written it up for an English audience. And I thought it was super detail rich. I would encourage you to read it. And in particular, what it does is it looks at some of the weapon systems that were more advanced, often longer range rocketry, and that were items that were being researched by the Ukrainian industry. And so whenever there have been attacks that have happened at a long range or deeper behind Russian lines, some of these same systems are sort of the usual suspects that are brought up as, oh, well, maybe the Ukrainians have finally perfected the Vilka, or perhaps they've finally got a couple of HRIM long-range missiles that will work for them. And if anything, what this thread said to me, if Schmut is reliable on all of these systems, and I know he's well placed to have this inside information, is that many of these systems were promising, and that either they were researched through shortly after the 2014 invasion, or in some cases researched right up to just before the February 24th full-scale invasion, but that in most of these cases, the work on these weapon systems is not continued, or they produced small numbers of them, and any inventory that exists would be quite small. And if they have been used to this point, it's likely that any use would have used that inventory up. And so he does speak to, for example, the Vilca specifically, that it was procured only in small quantities prior to the invasion. With regard to the HRIM, longer range ballistic missiles, he says that 2 erector launchers, which are the trucks that allow these missiles to be used, only 2 of the launchers were produced. Meaning that their inventory is quite small. And he goes on to say that no completed missiles have been assembled or flight tested. He then goes on to talk about several drone types, and there are some points about training, but I'm highlighting this because, to the extent that there had been speculation that some of these more advanced systems have been used, it's sounding like from this interview that's probably not the case, or it's unlikely to be the case going forward. And the reason I'm raising this is that if we know they're not the likely culprits, it means that in spaces, when there's breaking news and we're trying to figure out what was used, it will save us a little bit of time to say it's probably not a realistic option. We should be looking at other weapon systems instead. Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what you were just saying there. I have been in so many spaces where people have talked about the capabilities of these specific systems that are mentioned in this thread, and how they likely fit some of the capabilities that would be needed for a specific attack. And I don't have a military background, so I'm not capable of making a judgment on that. But it's probably a good reminder to the OSINT community in general, or the military people in general, all of us who frequent these spaces, that if we're not hearing about specific systems, there might well be a reason that we're not hearing about those specific systems. Maybe it's because they aren't actually in use. And sometimes the obvious answer is the actual answer, and maybe giving that a little bit more clout in our conversations is a more accurate way to do that.
Yeah, as much as we wish these systems were more readily available, it's just sounding like that has not been the case. I'll also note there is a little bit more detail provided in that interview about the Neptune, which is the longer range anti-ship missile that has received some credit for potentially having been used against the Moskva. And while that is possible, Schmoot does say that the Neptune it has a longer range, but that it's not a particularly sophisticated missile by modern anti-ship missile standards in its sensor and its maneuverability and so on, and that in fact Ukraine is keen to use harpoons that they're receiving from others, from Western supporters. And so that's just one more system where it may potentially have been used against the Moskva and done obviously great work there, but that it is not sort of a wonder weapon just because it's been domestically modified in Ukraine. The other, so this idea of unique weapon systems dwindling, really what that interview revealed is systems we thought had potential to exist are unlikely to be significant. There was another thread that might be a little controversial. It's a thread by Trent Talenko, who many of you will know has, maybe we'll call him an armchair analyst. And Trent and I chat from time to time, and I think he has some very interesting insights. Occasionally, things he suggests are not well received. I think this one is fairly reasonable. And so in this thread, it's the first item in the nest, he goes into some conversation about different calibers, particularly of smaller artillery pieces and mortars. And he's trying to dismiss the idea that munitions use in the defense of Bakhmut will be limiting to a future offensive. And his argument is he believes, and I'll admit he doesn't provide a lot of evidence in this particular thread, but he believes that some of the rarer calibers in terms of mortars and smaller guns of Soviet design are being concentrated for use in Bakhmut because at the moment, in many positions, it's a fairly fixed defense. And they can have those guns in place and used, and that they are using up these weirder caliber sets of ammo, with the implication being that reserves of more common NATO standard ammo, perhaps not 155 artillery, which obviously is a workhorse, but others may therefore be reserved for use in a coming offensive. And that while it would present a logistical nightmare at the moment to try to feed all of these different calibers, to the extent that they can do so in a fixed position and not have to worry about it being mobile, then they're making use of the ammo while they can, particularly against an enemy that they know is fairly tightly condensed. And that as these systems dwindle down, then they'll just transition to NATO options. Exit. Just before Exit goes ahead, if anybody has any thoughts on this, feel free to come up and chat. It's a funny thing in Spaces in that our conversation today was focused more on economic matters and regulatory matters, meaning that some of the weapons-focused folks who might be here to jump in on this topic are, they couldn't. Their stamina didn't allow them to listen all the way through to this point, so we might have a briefer conversation about this. But I may raise it again in future just to try to get some input from some of the former military folks as well. Exit, go ahead.
Just the two things that I took from these threads was that I am really concerned after our last couple of conversations and other spaces that we have frequented, that people aren't talking about the ammunition issues enough. From the Ukrainian side, we hear a lot about it from the Russian side, but we haven't really heard people talking about it as much as I think we probably should from the Ukrainian side. And watching them use up a whole bunch of smaller little bits and pieces, and knowing that logistics are becoming more and more of an issue makes me wonder how urgent the need is for ammunition, how much of an impact that's having on the battlefield and actual realities in Bakhmut. All of those things seem like questions that we probably should be paying a little bit more attention to, and I don't hear as discussed as much as I would like to hear them.
And so I'm reading these articles together as essentially a little bit disappointing news in terms of the exciting systems that we had hoped might be available, likely not being, which is the disappointing news. But then the sort of maybe unexpectedly good news is the idea that even if there are weird mixes of ammos in play and or some ammo supply, 120 millimeter and some of the rarer mortar calibers, to the extent that they are used up in a useful way in the defense of Bakhmut, what that does is potentially simplify the logistics chains going forward, and it means that more standard ammo can be reserved for an offensive. Small, go ahead.
No, I mean Trent's put out some really good stuff and some questionable stuff in the past, but I think he's maybe onto something a bit here. I mean, the priority for Ukraine is not Bakhmut; it's getting ready for their coming offensive. So they've got to integrate now, hopefully, a lot of the new NATO tanks and the AFVs and the armaments and munitions that go along with those, and setting up and making sure they've got the correct soldiers trained correctly in the right places. So they've undergone some great training in various European countries, and on the systems themselves. And with them having a mixy blob of different armor, they need to make sure that they've got that logistics set up correct for wherever they're going to go and push and make that focus, whilst maintaining the what seems to be the current strategy of attriting the Russians in Bakhmut. So yeah, so they can get rid of all of that ammunition they're potentially never going to need again, hopefully, and if we can get them to know in the future. But I think that's definitely one of the key aspects of it, because the logistics strain with so many different types of munitions and so many different launches for those is horrendous, really. And especially with, I can't remember the name of the muddy season, but the muddy season coming up, and one road in and out of Bakhmut at the moment. So yes, that simplifying that would be great. And just maybe to put something in on a Neptune thing, it was quite interesting to see that the seek ahead and the guidance was deemed to be less technologically advanced, such as the harpoons, when it did such great damage to, or not, it's not been claimed yet, it's not been officially stated that the Neptunes did the damage to Moscow and Sunka. But that just shows what sort of state the Russian Navy were in. They were just not watching at all. But yeah, that was quite interesting that they seem to have almost retired the Neptune, if you like, for the harpoons. And they've had the harpoons in country long enough now to actually have them deployed effectively. And again, that harks back to what I was talking about earlier with the grain initiative and those coastlines being sort of protected by the harpoons, obviously now.
Thanks very much, Smog. I see we've also been joined by Wolverine, who is one of our resident experts on weapon systems. And I know that Wolverine had only just joined the space, so he may not even heard the point we were making. So maybe I'll just put it to you, Wolverine. This thread that's in the nest, you may not have seen it. Perhaps you have. It's by Trent. It's essentially suggesting that Ukraine might be, because it's in generally fixed defenses around Bakhmut, it may be using the opportunity to use up some of its rarer or low stock ammunition types. And he's arguing that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if they do use up these rarer ammo types, that just means it streamlines logistics when they decide they're going to shift to the offensive. Do you think that's plausible? Do you think it's a good idea? What do you think?
So it depends on what munitions you're specifically talking about, because here's the kicker: is this? If you're talking tanks, there is no specific munition to tanks.
Yeah.
Because
So just to jump in, he's talking about lighter caliber guns, like 122 millimeter and in that category, 122, 152, and then he's also talking about some of the less common mortar calibers, so light guns and mortars.
So if you're so 122, you say yeah, you can say it's a lighter, but realistically it's not, because it's an artillery munition. Same with the 152s. So Ukraine currently actually is producing their own 152 millimeter ammunition for their guns that actually use that. But the thing is is that when you look at a whole on the majority of what they got, the Ukrainians need to keep on making and using the 122s and the 152 millimeter guns. And it's a simple reason of this is, which if Trent doesn't realize, otherwise besides Trent thing on tires, like everything else you said is not like all that good. But the thing is is Ukraine has to keep those systems for one specific reason, because they cannot use the US supplied or any NATO supplied weapon systems to hit into Russia. They can only use their organic gun systems for that, and they know that. So that's why they are going to keep on doing the hits. They've been doing it like Belgorod, Kursk, and all that. And those aren't special or light munitions. They are a common munition that is common, very much common to Warsaw Pact countries. So anybody who has whether it be 2S1 self-propelled, or I think it's D30s, which are 120 or 122 millimeter also, which are very popular. Any country that has them is actually going to be utilizing and producing that munition some aspect. Same with hold on, I gotta pause. Same with the 152, which they're actually producing in Ukraine, and there's other countries that are producing it. So the right now is, when they say, I mean, are they specifically referring to as the Ukrainians are going to run down their munitions for this, or are they talking about the Russian side running down their munitions?
So he's referring to the Ukrainians running down their munitions, so that even if the level is getting low, it makes sense to use that last little bit in a fixed position like this, and that when it runs out, it's not the end of the world, because then they'll just switch over to more standard NATO equipment.
Yeah, that's absolutely asinine. Because the thing is, the reason I say that is this: they're not using just 122 and 152 in Bakhmut. They are also using the 155. They're using the 155 in all different areas too. It just depends on what specific system, whether it's a Caesar, a 777, a 109er, or a PZH. It all depends on just which system they're using, because they still have a lot of Russian guns, and as long as they've gotten the ammo, which they acquired a substantial amount of ammo when they took Kupiansk and Lyman, add in the fact that they are producing 152 millimeter ammunition inside of Ukraine, it shows that they're not on the verge of getting rid of those systems yet, at least while the war is going on. And the other thing is this, is like, if you sit there, okay, like 2S1 self-propels, the thing is, people are like, oh, but it's 122. Yeah, it's a 122, but that vehicle system and the gun are actually very reliable. It's built on a proven chassis. The vehicle system itself is actually quite easy to maintain and repair, a little bit easier than some of the US systems also. So when you have a vehicle that can actually have multiple parts pulled off of multiple vehicles, then that makes it easier to fix. So, and the reason I say it is, so the 2S1 self-propelled, which is the 122, is based off of the Russian MTLB. So when I mean based off the Russian MTLB, it's basically the same hull, is just lengthened and then built up on a self-propelled. Uses the same transmission, same engine, same track, same road, so there's a lot of components that are in there. And if you look at the numbers of like MTLBs that the Russians or the Ukrainians have, the Ukrainians had like a ridiculous amount of MTLBs in storage, something like 5,000 to 6,000 MTLBs, and the Russians are still even using MTLBs. So when you've got a system like that that's easily repairable, easily maintainable, why you're going to get rid of it, especially in a situation like that, is you want more of the munitions, as long as you can keep them and as long as you can resupply them. Now, once you get it to where it gets critical levels, yeah, you would actually pull them back, or I'll assign them to one specific unit, to conserve that ammo to use that. But to say that they're going to get rid of all their specific munitions in Bakhmut is kind of not a very good statement to say, because even you go to mortar systems, okay, they're running. So what people don't realize is that the Russians and Ukraine, their standard mortar variants are 82 millimeter. Here in the U.S., we actually use 81 millimeter. Now, I don't know if those rounds can actually be used in it. I mean, it's quite possible. I just don't know because I've never experienced it. We do use 60 millimeter. They do use 60 millimeter also. The things that would determine if they can use that is chamber pressures. If the Russian / Ukrainian mortar tubes would be able to withstand the pressures that are produced by our mortar rounds. But if they can, then they can use that. But it's not that they're not going to send stuff down there that, like, let's say it's that they're going to waste what little bit of a have, because they are still producing all types of different munitions and weapon systems. That's why there's a lot of weapon systems that the Ukrainians actually pulled out, because they have a insane amount of munitions for. like MT-12s. You know, MT-12s are a towed anti-tank and 100 millimeter, but they use the same ammunition. Do they? Actually need to double check, but they're 100 millimeter guns. They pulled them out because they obviously needed them and they had a lot of ammunition. Same with the SPG-9, which is 73 millimeter recoilless rifle. If I remember correctly, it actually uses the same ammunition as the BMP-1 APC. So you got to look at, when you say munitions, you got to look at it, you know, you got to look at all across all the different weapon systems that they're using and see, okay, what uses this and what uses this type of ammunition. Because if you have, let's say I'm going to use 125 millimeter ammunition for the tanks, right? Because why? It's the one round that they use the most of. They have 4 different variations of tanks: T-64s, T-72s, T-80s, T-90s. Here's the kicker: it's all the same gun. It's basically a 2A46, and it doesn't. It may be a 2A46 M1 or 1 or whatever, but it's all 2A46 gun, and they can basically use all the same ammunition across all 4 vehicles. They use the same 12.7 millimeter. It doesn't matter if it may have a Dishka machine gun mounted on it, NSV or a Cord. It's the same 12.7. And for the coax, which is a PK variant, a PKT 762, it's the same ammunition. The only time you're going to run into the stuff having munition issues is newly arrived equipment that does not use a ammunition that the Ukrainians have. Good example of this is the Martyr. Okay, the Martyr uses a 20 millimeter ammunition. Okay, what do the Ukrainians use 20 millimeter on? Hardly anything at all. Same with the Bradleys. The Bradley uses a 25 millimeter ammunition. What else do they have that uses that? Nothing. But the thing that's going to help them is because the U.S. is going to supply them and has a capability to supply so much 25 millimeter ammunition that they don't have to worry about the issue that they had with the German Gepards of not being able to get enough 35 millimeter ammunition because someone else produces it. So, but those pieces of equipment, the equipment that they're getting in, are actually going to be the issues with the munitions. And the thing is, they're not going to be able to standardize anything until this war is done. Or, you know, let's say that all their T-series tanks are finally, you know, out of service and they get enough, whether it be Leopard 2s, M1A1, or whatever vehicles. It's not going to get standardized until after the war is done. You just can't sit there and, you know, do what they're doing and just sit there and wholly completely say, oh, we're getting rid of all of our T-64 up to T-90 series tanks because that's going to cripple them. I mean, it's just going to utterly defeat them. So, it's to say that is it's just someone who hasn't had it. It's asinine. That's all I can really say, because I would get too frustrated just thinking about it.
Well, I'm impressed that you've managed to contain yourself, you know, in use of colorful language, because I've heard you be more direct about your opinion, I think, of Trent in the past. Although he has occasionally gotten some calls pretty right. So if nothing else, I find his tweets interesting to drive conversation about, you know, is it on point? Why is it? Why might it not be? So anyway, thanks very much, Wolverine, for all of that detail. Okay, guys, I'm going to go maybe another 10 minutes just because I want to raise this last point, because it was two news items from this last week that I think you guys will find interesting and they're thought-provoking. If you have any comments on them, please feel free to come up and chat about it. But it's the sort of thing that that might drive conversation over, you know, a series of sessions. And this is the idea of the use of open source intelligence, and you know, the analysis techniques, in that they can be used for good, they can be used for bad purposes. And so I use the analogy from, obviously, you know, old cowboy movies, used in hacking as well, of white hat and black hat. and perhaps some people talk about the idea of gray hat, or people whose motives aren't, they might be self-interested, they might not be good, they might not be bad. So the two stories I'll draw to your attention are, it's the second and third items in the nest. The first of them is a tweet by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporter that is talking about a case of a Balkan criminal gang who used OSINT techniques to ultimately geolocate a rival gang leader. And once they figured out his location, they killed him. And this happened about 2 years ago. And the criminal investigations are, the documents behind the criminal investigations have just been released. And which is why it's a few years after the events. But many of the same things that we talk about in geolocation terms, they used. And so this rival crime boss had fled from Serbia, and it turned out that he fled to an island in Greece. And he was being particularly careful, but he was still posting some content to social media, which might sort of undo that careful statement, including pictures of him at a restaurant. But I suspect he may have believed that the background of the restaurant was so nondescript that it wouldn't give his location away. Or he posted a picture of a motorcycle that he rented. And in some cases, he wasn't posting these publicly, but he was circulating them to a small group that he chatted with. And it turns out that the opposing criminal group managed to turn one of the people in his inner circle who had access to his chats and his pictures. And they got these pictures and the restaurant photo, for instance. They saw in it that there was a lake in the background, or a bay in the background, that had a small islet in it. And that was unique enough that they were able to trace it to a region. They knew where the restaurant was. They didn't know specifically where he was, but it narrowed the region down. Or when he posted the motorcycle that he rented, then they were able to go and look up, motorcycle rental locations that might have the same model, and sort of cross-reference and overlap that area to see what was near the restaurant that they geolocated. And there are other interesting personal security considerations in there as well. So these chats were taking place over an encrypted messaging system called Sky that I don't know if it's widely used anymore. I think it's sort of it was one of the earlier private encrypted systems. And for purposes of the police investigation, they actually managed to crack the encryption on that system. I won't go into the specifics on how, but that's how they got access to all of these chat records that allowed them to begin the criminal investigation into the murder. At the same time, in geolocating this crime boss, it turns out that the way that this particular encrypted messaging system was distributed, you had to buy licenses. And they managed to somehow turn one of the people who was selling, or subscriptions to the encrypted communication system, and because of his sales position, he was able to look up one of the unique sort of app or user ID numbers and tell them the region code, or like the area code. So they were using all of these different OSINT techniques, geolocation, some of them relying on sort of firsthand corruption of information, but all interesting lessons about personal security. And ultimately, they wound up finding the man and killing him. And so, obviously, these things were taking place several years ago. Maybe we'll say where there's a will, there's a way, but it's just the idea is to be mindful about when we're teaching people what these techniques are. It's probably worth including a pitch about sort of the morality of it and why do you need to know. There's been a bit of a debate on Twitter about the geolocation of people to very specific spots. So most specifically, Elon was frustrated about people tracking his airplane. And then the idea that they were tracking not just his airplane, but they could monitor the road near the airport when his jet filed flight plans, knowing that somebody would be driving down that road to get to the airport to be on the aircraft. And so Twitter had cracked down a little bit and then backed off a little bit. But these are issues that are going to cause problems and concern more widely as we go forward. In doing a little bit of research for this, I also came across the fact that in the United Kingdom, private investigators are not regulated. In other countries like Canada and many US states, or Australia and New Zealand, have rules around the operation of private investigators, and they have to be licensed. But that in the United Kingdom, that's not the case. And that made me think about, boy, I wonder legally at what point the work that we do would cross over into being a private investigator. I pointed out that geolocation that I did, helping all source out of some people in Mexico. And I wonder, would that make me potentially be a private investigator? And it's a question in that specific case. I don't think it does, but I haven't looked it up specifically yet. So I would encourage you to sort of be mindful of those ideas of including morality, or thinking about why you're using OSINT techniques when you're teaching them to new people. At the same time, if you do any of this kind of work, whether it be cyber-based or whether it be geolocation or just general research, occasionally I get research requests from people, and they'll say, hey, can you geolocate this picture for me? And I'll say, well, why do you need to know? For example, when the Ukrainians launched their offensive in Kherson, they had a media blackout on. And there was some debate back and forth here on Twitter about what information is okay to reveal. And, if I had people say, hey, can you geolocate this picture? It's from Kherson, then there'd have to be a discussion about, well, should I even geolocate it? Because if I tell you where the geolocation is, are you going to go out and report on it contrary to the requested blackout? So it's relevant to those following the Ukraine war more closely as well. And then, so my last point, the second article, it's the third item back in the nest, a tweet by Shashank Joshi. He's the defense editor at The Economist, and he's interested in these issues generally. And that links to a Sunday Times article that talks about, in the United Kingdom, where private investigators are not particularly regulated, many ex-special forces and intelligence personnel have gone in to businesses being private investigators. Because there's so much finance that's done in the City of London, and because it's sort of a crossroads for lots of international people because of that finance, apparently big companies, they mentioned one in there called Diligence. I think it's something like Diligence International. They are big private investigation companies based in the UK, but operating around the world. And that, a lot of people who have done intelligence type work are going straight into that work that's less regulated. And this is why I call it gray hat, is because they're doing it for personal gain. But that article goes into one particular story about, I think it's something like the Eurasian Resource Consortium, who had hired a London-based lawyer. And apparently they believed that lawyer, by access to their records, realized that they were engaged in activity that may be criminal. And they believe that this lawyer reported them to the authorities, and they were investigated as a result. And apparently they were so angry at this possibility that they went out and spent something like $1.5 million on investigators and lawyers in an attempt to, like they had this London-based lawyer tracked by these ex-intelligence personnel, including around the world when he went on vacation. And so it's sort of a wild story. That Sunday Times article is paywalled, but if you copy its title and you paste it into Google, you will find a couple of links that explain the story in fairly good detail as well. So I'd encourage you to check those out. Sorry, I'm just going to bring up a speaker. So if you guys have any thoughts on this, it's something that I'm following. I'm going to look into the private investigator laws in Canada and the United States a little bit, because I think it's something that isn't talked about and may be worth discussing in a little more detail down the road. I see we've been joined, so I think we might have a couple hands. ID10T has joined us. Did you want to weigh in on this particular topic?
I was going to say, if someone's scratching their head in regards to white hat or black hat and would like some more information, freely available, YouTube, DEFCON, that's Delta Echo Fox, DEFCON. And you could just scroll down the videos of there and you can see a bunch of presumably white hats and their capabilities and how that applies to some of the tactics that's you're seeing gaining information.
And so I understand that's a famous hacker convention. And so you're talking about going and watching some of the talks from those past conventions?
Agreed, yes. It will kind of show the world of geekery, if you will. And to briefly explain, a black hat and a white hat, they essentially have the same skill set, where a black hat has nefarious intentions. White hats can openly collaborate and find vulnerabilities within a system, be it your key fob, your Wi-Fi router, your Honda Accord, and intentionally hack it and say, hey, here's your vulnerabilities, fix this.
Right. And sometimes that sort of gray zone can be pretty broad. And I see down in the audience that Jason is listening, and I think he laughed when I called DEF CON a hacker convention. So I'll have to compare notes with you after about what maybe the right terminology to describe it is. But anyway, I just wanted to introduce that topic and point out those two articles to you, because I suspect lots of listeners may be interested in them. So do check them out if you like them. I see one more hand, so maybe we'll give Pete the last word from the audience.
Hi there. First of all, I want to say this space is just absolutely intriguing. And I had a question to Michael or whoever else could possibly answer it. When I was in the Marine Corps, we used to use 106 recoilless rifles with flechettes for anti-personnel. And I was wondering if they're even legal anymore, or if they're being used in Bakhmut in Ukraine, because I hear of all these mass attacks, and I was thinking that 106 with flechettes would help a great deal.
My understanding is that flechettes in some uses are prohibited. And I know they are in use, but it may depend on if you're signed to a convention, but I suspect Wolverine has the answer.
So right now, I have not seen anything suggesting that there are any type of flechette munitions being used in Ukraine right now. I haven't seen that. I mean, I could be wrong, but I can double check with some of the books I got. But flechettes was not like a huge thing that with the Russian systems that they really did. That was more the U.S. was one of the few countries who did that. You know, because if you look back to during World War I, Germany tried to outlaw the use of our shotguns because they thought they're unhumanitarian, and we obviously just expanded it from 12 gauge up to 155 millimeter or 105 millimeter. So I haven't seen too many countries other than us really do that and use them. But even the U.S. side, I got out of the Marines in '03. I don't think we had any flechette rounds. I know our M1A ones, they have a round that they use. I don't think it's a canister round, but they call it something else. But it's not I don't think there are that many countries that you would use it. And even though in the defensive it may be useful, but if you're having to use a flechette round or a canister round, that means the enemy really is a lot closer than you really want to be. So one thing on that also, which literally as I said that I brought up, is the 105 guns. I actually do remember them using them. And like some, when you read some stories in Vietnam where the artillery units were using them, well, Ukraine actually has 105 guns from us. They're from Lithuania, but from us, and then they also have L119s, M119s that are from us and the UK. But I've not seen any usage or anything saying that the United States has given Ukraine any type of flechette or canister munitions.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer, Wolverine.
I really appreciate it coming from a fellow Marine. And anyways, thank you, Wolverine, and thank everybody here for all the detailed information. I really appreciate it.
All right, and so with that, I'll just a few administrative notes. Our next conversation will be Thursday at 9 p.m. as always. And then, so set your reminder for that. It is in the nest if you'd like to put it in your calendar. Also a note, I mentioned early in our conversation today that a week from now, 4 p.m. next Sunday, we're hoping to have a conversation about that's focused on translation. And I think that's going to be a particularly interesting conversation. So, consider joining us then as well. Tonight, we have another space by a friend of the community. Aaron is holding his at, I believe it's 10 p.m. And so that's the second item in the nest in case you'd like to come back and listen or join in and chat some more. And then finally, just a reminder that we are curious to see how you guys interact with the material we put up, whether in the nest or in the thread. There's a poll about that in the nest at the moment, third item back. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment just to let us know how you prefer to interact, that'll maybe determine whether we keep putting up all kinds of links or whether we focus on just material in the conversation. Before we completely wrap up, Wolverine, did you want to add one more thing?
No, you already answered it. That's why I put my hand down.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thanks very much to everybody who contributed to the conversation, particularly to our guests tonight, including Mike Lee, Exit, and Smog. I think the work you guys are doing is incredibly interesting. I'd encourage those listening to check their work out, and I think it's deserves a follow. And of course, thanks once again to Exit and then to Jacoby as my co-hosts, without whom I couldn't hold these spaces. And I look forward to chatting with everybody on Thursday night.